Growing with fishes. Growing with fishes.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Growing with Fishes podcast, episode 293. We have a returning guest today, Mike West. Thanks for joining us, Mike.
What's up, Steve? Long time no see.
Yeah, man. He actually also had a chance to come take a class that we taught down at Dutch Bloom's farm, and we're gonna.
What was that? 2019, 2018, 2019, I think.
Yeah, 2018 and 2019. Yeah, June. I think June of 2019. Yep.
Yep.
Before the plague, the before times.
The before times, back when biology was respected, before ignorant trolls decided to lock us all down instead of spreading biodiversity in our gut microbiome. So.
Oh, we've very much covered with Kevin McKernan some of the different aspects of that particular topic, and gotten to some of the other topics on that. So, thanks a lot.
Many of the cannabis growers know this, right? This isn't the first plague that humans have dealt with. It won't be the last. Just like it's not the first time your plant's got some sort of pest on it. It won't be the last. The key is, developing an ecosystem so that when these bad bacteria, bad fungal, bad viruses start getting spread, that we can respond with it, respond to it responsibly, have societal systems in place that way we can mitigate those risks by. I don't think necessarily lockdowns were as necessary as they became, but we do need the ability to be able to test, identify who is sick, and be able to treat those people, whether it be with FDA approved drugs or not. If we have scientific studies showing that there's one thing or another showing antidotal beneficial properties, then we need to be able to show that. I guess I'll get started. How did I get in the industry, right? I got into the cannabis industry because I have had several family members with severe medical conditions that would have been benefited by cannabis had it been available. My sister had severe epilepsy. I've actually had multiple family members with cancer, Alzheimer's. I'm actually going to the celebration of life for my uncle this weekend because he also is, suffering from a terminal brain cancer that has actually been treated with a water-soluble injectable THC, but doesn't have an FDA-approved treatment yet. So I got really interested in cannabis in the early 2000s after reading Ethan Russo's paper on treatment of cannabinoids for non-treatable epilepsy, and having my sister had epilepsy, I got real interested in, how can we take cannabis? And since I had a family of doctors, my interest was, okay, how can I take cannabis, an herbal plant, extract it, turn it into a potential pharmaceutical or nutraceutical or even FDA approvable drug? That way we can make cannabinoid drugs available to patients and doctors. I had a family of doctors, and most of those doctors, when they found out that I was using herbal cannabis, I essentially became the black sheep of the family because everyone else in the family used FDA approved drugs. So I ended up moving to Colorado because I knew Colorado had a medical program like California at the time in the late 90s, early 2000s, and became one of the first couple hundred medical patients in Colorado. Ended up getting really active while I was at university, organizing some normal chapters that held a bunch of the 420 events in Colorado in the 2000s through the 2010s. And then after graduating from college in 2010, the medical industry had just been legalized in 2008 in Colorado. So I ended up partnering with a law firm who was my criminal defense attorney back when I got arrested. And he and I ended up starting to help medical growers, medical patients start going through the process of getting their medical marijuana business licenses in Colorado. So ended up helping a couple of companies in Colorado transition from the black market into the medical market, and then leading up into 2012 with the passage of 64 in Colorado, prepping those companies to be able to apply for the recreational licenses. But I was smart enough to be able to, having somewhat of a legal background, legal degree, I started looking at the laws in Colorado, Oregon, and Washington. And one big glaring thing that kind of popped out to me was that, Colorado was going to be vertically integrated, whereas Washington State was going to be vertically separated. For the listeners that don't know, vertical integration means that if you own a retail store in Colorado from 2008 till I believe 2014 or 15, 80% of the cannabis that you sold at your retail store 70% of the cannabis grown at your retail store had to be grown by your own grow. Well, I'm not a retail guy. I'm a farmer primarily, also an extractor. I'm a chemist traditionally by college training. So I knew that if I'm a producer, manufacturer, and an extractor, the likelihood of being successful in Colorado when I can only sell through the retail shops that I own was really limited. So back in the early 2010s, moved up to Washington State, ended up helping a medical company transition into the recreational market, and ended up building a grow as well as a extraction lab, one of the first CO2 extraction labs in Seattle, Washington State, that ended up getting licensed. So I've been running extraction labs since about 2008, but solvent extraction labs since about 2010. And since then, it's really been a whirlwind. We've built labs in Colorado, Washington, Oregon. I've consulted labs in about a dozen other states, and currently actually in Canada. But what really kind of got me interested in it was the fact that, hey, we have a plant that hasn't been researched for almost 100 years. And we now have modern day scientific technology. 100 years ago, pre-prohibition, we didn't have solvent extraction, supercritical extraction. The only thing that was really available were the traditional extracts, things like dry sieve, pressed hash, and charas, with very small availability of things like tincture. So tinctures date back hundreds, if not thousands of years. So what I really wanted to do was try and follow that thing where, hey, we're taking cannabis, which has been prohibited, transitioning cannabis into products like extracts or isolates that could then essentially be tested, formulated into medical products, and then essentially distributed through medical channels. At the time, I didn't think they would be able to have recreational products, but the transition of recreational certainly allowed the industry to grow a little bit faster. The smart recreational companies realized they had to be able to cater to medical patients as well as recreational consumers. So some of the most successful multi-state operators, and we can talk about those a little bit later, are ones that really focused on not only being able to produce the recreational products for the consumers, but also be able to have the medical patients, products for the medical patients. Random chat question: what best method for crashing diamonds with ethanol, or where to get clean butane? So
hold on, before you get into that, I did want to just mention I had kind of forgotten about the 70% rule there in Colorado. It's been a while since I worked in Colorado. That I thought that wasn't necessary. While it is an interesting and maybe overly burdensome regulation, I thought it was kind of cool because it kind of had this forced honesty where people kind of had to put up or shut up. They had to either prove that they knew what they're doing, or they, were kind of kicked out of the market. And I thought, at least in terms of that extent, I thought that was kind of a great point to that way of regulating it. And I haven't seen that model replicated in other markets. And I just wanted to kind of touch on that real quick before we totally change subjects.
Yeah, a lot of the more heavily regulated East Coast markets are also doing some form of vertical integration. It is beneficial if you're, and I think that every retail shop should be able to build relationships with producers. Canada doesn't allow retail shops to buy from a farm. So here in Canada, I have to sell to the government that the provincial governments then sell to the government stores or private retail stores. So I don't actually get to build that rapport or relationships with the retail stores. I think that's one of the biggest issues here in Canada currently. But the inverse side of that is, if I'm a medical producer trying to produce medical products, I want to be able to have my products in 50 stores, not just the stores owned by my business partners. So I think the Colorado 70% rule was limited to flower. You could still extract and manufacture products, but you weren't allowed to sell flower B2B. So if I was a extractor trying to buy at the time, CBD flower wasn't really available. So I literally would have to grow my own CBD flower in my medical garden just to be able to process it into a variety of different tinctures or manufactured products. I think in Colorado they opened it up so you can have non-vertically integrated grows starting in 2015 or 16. So now there are grows that kind of good growers focus on growing. What I saw happen in the years following legalization in Colorado was that there was a lot of shotgun marriages where great growers who love to grow and produce good products had to build relationships, sometimes strained relationships, with guys who owned retail stores. And the growers became essentially beholden to that retail store for that distribution outlet. That created natural born monopolies in the same way that some of the multi-state operators have essentially created monopolies in their states by having limited numbers of producer or retail licenses. So these are all what I call stumbling blocks on the road to legalization. Every state is going to write their own rules. Those rules are going to get put into place. That state or market becomes a laboratory of democracy. And then the markets or states that pass rules down the road, they're going to look at those early adopting states and say, hey, this worked really well for Colorado and Oregon. This worked really well in Washington. This worked well in California. Let's hybridize these rules into, for example, our East Coast new markets rules. That way we can mitigate some of the negative economic side effects of potentially overproduction, potential black market backdoor selling, et cetera, while at the same time being able to create a fair and equitable market while minimizing, hopefully, the things like crony capitalism, monopolization, and unfair business practice by unscrupulous bankers or businessmen. So, what we can talk about, what I figured we talk about tonight, obviously we'll go deep in this solvent extraction, processing, how to do it sustainably, but also talking about many of the growers that I see watching these videos are home growers, medical growers, and being able to have those tools or kind of hear somebody like me who's gone not only through the state regulated, but also federally regulated licensing. There is a light at the tunnel. It sucks. We were talking before the show. It sucks having to spend hours and weeks writing SOPs, writing security plans, doing the business licenses. But you only got to do that up until the point that you get your license, and then your SOPs are written. You're just revising those SOPs, constantly updating them, integrating them, and making them better. So oftentimes, many times within the market, there's this cyclical market cycle where a new market passes new rules and regulations. There's a huge rush for green rushers to get into the industry. The OGs have already been in the industry. They just need a transition. And oftentimes we need to be able to see that like, hey, there's a pathway to legalization. There's a pathway to success. And even though a significant percentage of the market's going to fail as a business, there are going to be ways that you can kind of swim, keep swimming, as Dory used to say, and eventually get to the headwaters where you're going to be successful. You're going to be producing quality product. It's going to be produced on a regulated market, and even though you're not going to be making as big of margins as we did in the black market, having a smaller margin allows for us to grow at a much larger pace, and to a point that I'm currently working with a company that's exporting to 3 countries. I've even had a couple of CBD companies down in the US that are exporting to places like South America, Asia, and Europe. So there are ways that there are companies in the US as well as in Canada that have not only gotten federal license, but are in the process of exporting product abroad. It's just a ton of paperwork that people shouldn't be afraid to do. You just need to find the advisors, find the consultants, find the lawyers that are familiar with permitting for importing and exporting, finding the people that are familiar with sanitation for getting through the FDA. Because one of the things that I've seen here in Canada, being a federal program, is that getting the provincial licenses, getting your business license on a local level, very similar to down in the States. I still got to go do all the building permits, convince the local authority having jurisdiction, the city council or jurisdiction, that, hey, here's what we're doing, here's how we're doing it safely, here's how we're going to mitigate the risks, here's how we're going to meet all the local codes. But then you start adding the provincial and federal rules, and those federal rules are things like down in the States going to be regulated, things that are going to be regulated by OSHA. And OSHA cannot regulate the cannabis industry, should be, but cannot legally regulate the cannabis industry until after federal law passes. So what's likely going to happen is that when federal law passes, you're going to see a whole wave of regulators like OSHA, the FDA, the EPA coming out and actually citing and having to push these companies to transition from what may be state compliant, but is not considered GMP or GPP, good production practice, good manufacturing practices. And even though there are, it sucks dealing with the federal regulators. Ultimately, those federal regulators are there to protect the customers. So we need to be able to have some ability to protect the customers, because the last thing we want to do is have unscrupulous businesses spraying pesticides on plant material, that getting into the public and causing some sort of national over-regulation. So yeah, main reason why I got into solvent extraction was, because I was interested in isolating those active compounds, primarily the cannabinoids, but as I came to learn later, the cannabinoids, terpenoids, polyphenols, thiols, and all the other beautiful terpenoids that contribute to the entourage effect. But back when I was in college, I was looking at, okay, what are the ways that we can make it an FDA approvable drug? And unfortunately, the FDA in its approval process is fairly limited in scope. They do not like producing or researching or regulating or doing what's called double-blind placebo trials in phase 1 through phase 3 clinical trials. They don't like to do that when you have a drug that's got multiple active ingredients. So what the FDA is really looking for, if you want to produce something on a federally regulated, insurable level, is monomolecular isolates. So when you look at companies like GW Pharma that actually got Marinol and Sativex approved, they went through the process where they would actually cultivate cannabis in the UK, extract it to its monomolecular distillate or isolate form, formulate that into things like Marinol, which is a pill and with grapeseed oil tincture in a little small round gel cap, Sativex, which is I believe, nasal injection, but monomolecular. So it's pure CBD and I believe Sativex, or pure THC and Sativex, pure CBD.
Can I ask you a question on this? What's the difference? Because I've gotten in debates on this. What's the difference between Marinol and Sativex? Somebody told me that Marinol is a synthetically structured molecule versus Sativex, which is an extract. Is that true?
Yes. So before Marinol was FDA approved, I believe, I don't know this from firsthand, so this is all hearsay, but I believe, as I heard from the doctor, before cannabis was FDA approved as Marinol, they could not actually cultivate cannabis and send it through the drug trials. So what they ended up producing is essentially, there's more than one way to produce THC. There's actually ways that you can synthetically produce THC from olivetilic acid. And essentially one of the precursor terpenoids that are found within cannabis. You can actually extract that out of a couple of different plants and lichens. So in order to get the Marinol approved, they actually started with a synthetic conversion of dronabinol, and it's just basically producing THC using chemistry. and then used that synthetically produced THC to go through the drug trials and pursue their first series of patents. After they had proven the efficacy and safety of THC, they were able to go through phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. Phase 3 is where you actually give it to the humans. They were able to show the safety and efficacy of that synthetically derived THC molecule. And after the FDA had the documentation that, hey, nobody's overdosed on this, we can't determine an LD50, a level at which we can kill people. They, by law, after FDA approving THC in its synthetic form, had to allow that producer to be able to produce THC in whatever way was easiest. So obviously I can produce THC using chemistry, but it's going to be a lot energetically less demanding producing THC via photosynthesis. So when they came out with their second generation of pharmaceuticals, Sativex, they actually switched from synthetically derived to THC isolated from the plant matter. We've seen the same thing more recently with the hemp trend, where people are converting CBD into THC or delta 8 THC, as well as converting products like CBGV or CBDV into THCV. So there are many different chemical ways that we can essentially take cannabinoids, using chemistry, manipulate them into either changing the location of a double bond, adding bonds within their chemical structure. But all of this falls above and beyond what we know of as cultivation and falls, according to the FDA and DEA, into the manufacturing of drugs. And in general, the DEA and FDA, if you're going to be manufacturing drugs, they want you to be able to have some form of regulatory oversight. Here in the US, that regulatory oversight is generally handled by these states. Although we are seeing some players in the hemp industry getting stern warning letters from companies or groups like the FDA or DEA, basically saying, hey, you can't make medical claims. If you're going to be making medical claims on your CBD products, you have to go through the drug trials. You have to get NIDA to supply the drugs and go through the double-blind placebo trials, phase 1, 2, 3. And once you can actually have the monomolecular isolates and drug trials documentation, then we can actually review and approve that use. So, the way that they were originally doing their isolates was actually a chromatographic isolation. So going through a solvent extraction, generally with ethanol. After you go through the ethanol, go through a fractional distillation, what we call producing distillate. And then on the THC side, that distillate could essentially be cleaned up using chromatography to produce a pure THC fraction, or in the case of CBD, a pure CBD fraction. So there's a question earlier for best way of producing diamonds. The best explanation for producing diamonds is much like producing rock candy. You need to supersaturate your solution regardless of what solvent you're using. I prefer alkenes because they have a lower boiling point, but you can use ethanol. If you were going to be using ethanol, what I would try and do is vacuum distill the ethanol off while keeping your boiling flask as cold as possible, continually adding a saturated solution and then constantly increasing the saturation of that solution so that the THC precipitates onto itself. My favorite solution for producing diamonds is going to be probably butane, propane, or pentane. I prefer pentane, although many people have, in many of these pictures that we're showing, is a butane extraction. So what they'll actually do is do a butane extraction, do it at a very cold temperature to minimize the lipids and waxes from getting extracted. Generally send it through a series of filters, and likely in some of these whiter pictures, what's called chromatography, the CRC, color remediation chromatography column, which is a media that actually has properties much like a filter or an RO filter. It's going to absorb the polyphenols, the carotenoids, and the phospholipids that get extracted in your solvent. So once you've essentially used that media to absorb all the undesirables, you can pump that THC solution into your collection vessel, slowly boil off your solvent while continually adding greater amounts of saturated solution. And that, just like growing rock candy, what you do, boil hot water. Hot water is going to absorb lots of sugar. As that water cools, the water is going to hold less and less of that sugar, forcing that sugar to come out of solution, precipitate growing that rock candy. Same thing happens with THCA and CBD. THC and CBDA don't like to form a crystalline lattice structure, but THCA and CBD happen to. So yeah, as shown in this picture, we take a crude oil that's essentially our THC oil that's dissolved in a media or dissolved in a solution. We pump that through the filter media here. Generally, that filter media is a combination of chromatographic silica, bentonite clay. Some people use things like activated charcoal. There's even people that are using fryer grease, magnesium silicates, because each of those actually has properties that'll absorb the undesirable compounds while allowing the non-polar cannabinoids to pass through. At the bottom of that filter media, there's a filter paper, generally that's less than 2 microns ideally. And then you've got a filter plate that holds everything in place. The only thing that's getting through there is going to be your cannabinoids and your solvent solution that you can then distill off. So the reason why a lot of people are using things like ethanol instead of butane, propane, pentane, or heptane is because ethanol is well known to many of the fire marshals. If I go to a fire marshal in a rural jurisdiction, which I've done, and said, hey, I'm building a giant alcohol still, they're going to know what I'm talking about. When I go to a fire marshal in a relatively rural jurisdiction and say, hey, I'm going to be doing a chromatographic column of hydrocarbons following a supercritical extraction, they're going to think I'm building an oil refinery. And they're going to be worried that I'm going to be spilling oil or solvents into the watershed. So oftentimes, many of their early regulators, think people like fire marshals are relatively standoffish on using flammable solvents, things like butane, propane, pentane, hexane, heptane, because they have to be done in what's called a C1D1 environment, class 1 division 1, which basically means you have to do that processing in a laboratory built and designed to be able to handle that flammable and potentially explosive solvent.
Not only that, but you get into weird zoning laws and standoff from main roads. When you're talking about, so say if I want to do a really large facility, I have to have hundreds of gallons of ethanol or butane or propane. And when you hit at certain thresholds with, and I'm not going to get into those because I don't want to get us on a whole other list that I'm sure both of us are already on, but basically you have different thresholds when you have different, 500 gallons, 1,000 gallons, whatever. That you have to be a half a mile or a mile away from the road or other, domestic residential areas or other things. So it gets really wonky zoning wise. And people often don't think about that when they're planning their extraction facilities, especially when they're talking about future scaling.
Yeah, so many people just think, hey, if I'm going to spill my solvent on the ground, I'm going to turn on my fan and it's just going to blow it outside. Well, if you actually dig into the OSHA, the EPA rules, you can't just let it blow off. You either, if you're going to blow it off through your ventilation stack, you actually have to have what's called a spark arrestor, basically something to burn that material, convert it from a flammable gas into carbon dioxide on your exhaust port. But more importantly, in order to protect the environment, there are federal rules in place that actually say, hey, if you're going to have 100 gallons of flammable solvent in your facility, you have to have not only primary containment, the tank it's stored in, but also secondary, tertiary, and depending on how much solvent you have, further layers of containment. So that if I have a 100-gallon tank of something and accidentally cut it, I've got a 120-gallon reservoir to capture that solvent directly beneath it. And even if that, for some reason, it has the drain port open, I have another containment, say a tank farm sitting around my tank farm to then capture anything that spills over. Because before I got into the cannabis sector, before it was legal to have a job in the cannabis sector and I was just a medical patient, I actually worked in the biofuels and oil industry. So I got to learn many of the different types of oil refining that we are now doing in the essential oil industry. But it's a lot more heavily regulated in the oil industry because you're dealing with, thousands of gallons as opposed to liters. Many people in the cannabis industry in the US, because they're not federally regulated, have yet to sit down with groups like industrial hygienists or OSHA auditors or FDA auditors, GMP auditors. And all of this stuff is going to create a come to reckoning when the federal doors are kicked open. I'm not going to hold my breath for federal laws, but when federal law passes and allows interstate, I have facilities that are ready to start exporting either interstate or internationally. They're built to GMP code. They're built to EU GMP code. And as soon as I can start shipping from the West Coast to the East Coast, we will. But we can't until federal law change. That's actually why I moved up to Canada a few years ago in 2019, was because, after building a couple relatively successful companies in the Midwest, in Washington, Colorado, when Canada passed their federal law, I kind of gave myself the choice. Okay, do I move to California and get in California's rec scene, or do I move to Canada? Well, California has a more established medical scene, but they're going to be limited to their state boundaries. Canada has the same population as California. It's a lot bigger geographically, so shipping product across the country is a pain. Dealing with the provincial distribution boards is a pain. But I can export to Europe. I can export to Israel. I can export to. So there was actually a greater potential of growth here in Canada than many of the US companies are going to be able to grow in the next 5 years. So yeah, after building
in Zimbabwe, we bought a pharmaceutical license in Zimbabwe. We can automatically distribute to 29 countries. And it's between South Africa and Zimbabwe. We can do whatever we want to. So
was that a public pharma company?
No, this was actually, we bought it's a privately held company, but we purchased a formerly owned Johnson & Johnson company pharmaceutical license. So
nice.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's
to knock out somebody like that. You know what I mean?
Well, and we'll call this Mike's tip for OGs getting into the cannabis sector. Tip number 1, right? There's going to be a lot of green rushers that get into the cannabis industry that don't know how to produce, don't know how to grow quality. They're going to spend. I just saw a facility here in Canada, in Alberta, one of the largest publicly traded companies. Hearsay, but I heard they spent somewhere between $15 and $25 million building this facility, and they sold it on an online auction for $3 million in the last 3 months. So
I know exactly the facility you're talking about because I walked through it when I was out there.
Yeah, you have. You have. So for those of you that are watching this video and want to get into the industry, but maybe a couple years behind, maybe didn't have the financial resources to get in with the first round of licenses. I've seen tons of licenses for sale in Washington, in Oregon, and Colorado that are, I don't want to say pennies on the dollar, but a fraction of the value of what they were originally raising their capex for. So they came out saying, oh, we're going to be a $20 million company. 3 years later, they didn't produce the quality. They ended up mothballing their facility. Their head grower got fucked over, so left and ended up selling that facility to a new grower who actually knew how to grow for a song. And then months later, that facility ends up producing quality. Yeah. So there was a question about de-waxing. Is it a must? Well, it's not a must if you like smoking mids. If you like smoking lipids, don't do it. I, for one, care about my lungs and would prefer to smoke as few of those lipids as possible. So let me break that down for everybody. When I use a solvent or mechanical separation of those glandular trichromes, you're producing, everyone knows what a trichrome is, right? It looks like a little ball sphere. Within that sphere are what's called micelles and vacuoles, plastids that essentially produce those terpenoid precursors. Those terpenoid precursors go from the base cell into the vesicle, where the two precursors bind together, become the cannabinoids or terpenoids, and they're stored in that glandular trichrome because they actually will break down plant matter and kill the beneficial bacteria. So the plants produce those glandular trichromes to protect the plant and its microbacteria from the essential oils produced in that trichrome. When we use mechanical separation, we're breaking that glandular trichrome off the stalk and essentially concentrating glandular trichromes that contain the essential oils in a waxy cuticle envelope. So when we go to press, bubble hash, or dry sift into products like rosin, what we're essentially doing is extruding those essential oils, the cannabinoids and terpenes, from that waxy cuticle. Now, depending on what temperature you press your rosin at, you can actually melt, because if it's hot enough, you'll reach the melting point of some of those lipids and waxes. And those lipids and waxes then can get carried through your extract into your concentrated rosin. In the solvent realm, and why it's become so popular with the diamond production, when I use a solvent to dissolve those essential oils, many of those solvents also dissolve things like esters, lipids, waxes, polyphenols, terpenes, and phospholipids. So when I talk about the trichrome, the solvent will actually dissolve the waxy cuticle on the outside, as well as some of the cell walls of those plastids that contain things like phospholipids. That's then going to get extracted into your solution of solvent with your cannabinoids. When you boil off that solution, you're generally left, back in the day, we called it a wax, an earwax, or a honeycomb, but it's basically a cannabinoid extract that's going to range anywhere from 50 to 85% total potency with some terpenes in it, and then anywhere from 5 to 25% lipids, waxes. Yeah, there we go. So your hash is essentially going to be a conglomeration of all of those cells. When we press that cell using heat and pressure in the process that the industry calls rosin, we're extruding the essential oils from those secretory vesicles. But if you press your rosin at a hot enough temperature, you can actually reach the melting point of your lipids and waxes. So that ideally, as with all things, the slower and slower you press your rosin, the less of those triglycerides and diglycerides will end up getting extracted to higher quality rosin. The same is true with solvent extraction. If I use a heated solvent, it's going to have more of that energy to dissolve the oils, lipids, and waxes than if I use a chilled solvent. So in the I think it was about 2010, 2012, it kind of became popular to start dewaxing, making shatter. People started doing it as early as 2007, but it became kind of a commercial product in Colorado and Oregon and Cali in the early 2000s. So what people started doing in the
2010, 2011, I think is when I first saw it in Colorado.
Yeah, totally. So what people started doing was, after they got their cannabinoids and waxes into solution, they would chill that solution down. And if you think about taking a dish of butter that's warm, it's going to be melted. If I put that dish of butter at room temperature, it's going to start to coagulate, start to turn solid. Well, I put it in the fridge, it's going to just turn kind of into its soft, buttery consistency. If I put it into a freezer, it's going to freeze solid. Same thing's true with all the lipids and waxes that are in cannabis extracts. When it's in that solution, if the solution's heated, it's going to be really hard for those waxes to precipitate out. when you chill that solution in the process that's called winterization, you're actually forcing those lipids that are, depending on its molecular mass, to start coagulating, sticking to each other, and then we can essentially filter that out. If you do not filter those waxes out, those waxes are going to entrain the THC molecule, right? They're going to hold the THC molecule inside those waxes, not allowing you to produce those diamonds. So if you leave things like diglycerides in there, you'll produce a sappy shatter, but you won't be able to produce those diamonds. So we would just sum it up. We could not produce crystalline monomolecular THC until after we started doing the winterization process. So the only way you can kind of skip winterization is if you're doing an extraction at a temperature cold enough to not extract those waxes and lipids in the first place. So many of the butane and propane extractors have started extracting at -20. That allows for them to essentially freeze the waxes on the plant matter. The THC becomes soluble, but most of those triglycerides do not. Some of the diglycerides do, but monoglycerides as well. But most of the triglycerides, large molecular weight waxes, will essentially get frozen in solution and not be able to be extracted. Now, when CO2 kind of became popular, because CO2 is generally done at a little bit higher of a temperature, the boiling point of CO2 in Fahrenheit's 89 degrees. So you're essentially heating your solution to make it force into supercritical. So many people who were doing CO2 extraction had to winterize their solution, generally in an ethanolic solution. But you could also use things like methanol, heptane, hexane, pentane, if you had the proper C1D1 fume hoods. So generally people had to winterize if they were going to make a shatter. And then the explosion of hemp in the middle of the 20 teens is what led a lot of the people to start looking at chromatographic isolation of monomolecular THC and CBD, which then led into the production of THC, what we call diamonds. So yeah, I started hunting, breeding CBD strains after getting some hybrids that Ringo made in the early 2000s. I do really well with actually a 1-to-1, so CBD and THC. I find that it kind of helps reduce my stutters, my disabilities, while at the same time allowing me to be relatively productive. And then obviously transitioning to THC in the evening times when I'm trying to go to bed, turn off my hyperactive brain and chill the fuck out. So the lost my train of thought. Diamonds. So what we ended up seeing in the early 2000s, when hemp kind of had the door kicked open with the Farm Bill, all of a sudden people started realizing, hey, I can grow an acre of cannabis, but if I can produce it without any THC, I can grow 50 acres of hemp. So I ended up helping a couple farms in Colorado and Oregon end up, transitioning from medical cannabis growers into being hemp growers, to a point that we were growing about 600 acres in Eastern Oregon, and then extracting it using ethanol, going through the whole winterization process, fractional distillation to produce distillate. And then in states that allowed CBD, we were actually going through the process of turning it into CBD isolate. So CBD isolate isn't necessarily necessary unless if you're trying to sell it into a market that has zero tolerance for THC. So a couple of the companies I've worked with actually were developing distribution networks, developing markets where we could produce CBD manufactured products and export them to places like Asia Pacific, South America, Europe. So we would actually produce CBD isolate, manufactured into tinctures, topicals, pills, dosable products, and then exporting that CBD manufactured product to places like China, South America, Europe. some of those countries, I don't want to stereotype, but some of those countries that are predominantly Catholic and very anti-cannabis allowed CBD, but when they passed their federal law, they said, hey, we're only going to allow CBD to be imported if it's 0% THC. So many of the hemp producers here in the US and in North America quickly realized that, hey, if I take it all the way to a distillate, it's going to be 98%, 92 to 98% THC or CBD, but it's still going to have trace amounts of THC in it. So I had to pull out my college chemistry textbooks and read up on chromatography back in the 2011 through 2015 when we were developing chromatography.
I wanted to ask you on that, when you're reading up on that, isn't there a guy back in the 30s or 20s or something like that, Dr. Willard or Dr. Wilson, Dr. something like that, that did some of the early CBD and THC stuff before World War II? I can't remember his exact name. Dr.
Yes.
W something.
Yeah. So there's a long history of cannabinoids, but they actually didn't identify the chemical structure of THC until 1964. So that prior to that, they were actually doing extraction and distillates of the cannabinoids, actually dating back to the 1700s. One of the, if we all know the story of, have heard the stories of the philosopher's stones, prior to chemistry being a term, we called it alchemy. And one of those alchemical stories actually spoke of a process where we would take plant matter and mix it with vita vitale, aka ethanol, to produce a green solution that they called the green lion or green dragon. So one of my companies we started in Seattle was called Green Lion, named after I believe it was a 1740s reference to a green lion tincture that was produced out of vita vitale, ethanol. And then from that green lion tincture, they would send it through a distillation to turn it yellow, and then a crystallization to turn it into what they called the philosopher's stones. So there's between 300 and 600 years of cannabis extraction experience, but many of that had to be done through occult writings. We couldn't talk about, converting or producing things like isolates early on because of the wrath of the church. They'd call us witches. But then we had a big boom in the 1800s through the early 1900s, where many ethnobotanical plants were turned into products like tinctures. Laudanum was a thing in the 1800s into the early 1900s. But with the advent of, with the outbreak of World War I, all of a sudden they wanted to be able to have, the US federal government wanted to be able to treat veterans that got hurt, but didn't want to have a unregulated bonanza of medical products where people were producing all sorts of medical products that contained mercury and saying it was going to be good for your bones joints when it really was destroying your bone joints. So the FDA ended up early on passing those rules that said, hey, if you're going to produce a drug, it has to go through some sort of drug trial and it has to be monomolecular. That set back the whole herbal supplement industry a century, 100 years. But we're now just starting to come out of that. Many of the research of cannabinoids that should have been done in the 30s, 40s, 50s didn't get done until the 60s through the 80s, and actually really just starting up again over the last decade. So yeah, I think what they had done in the 40s, was it 40s or 50s? 50s is when they identified the boiling point. I think it was 64 that that they started identifying the chemical structure. So identifying, hey, it's got this many hydrogens, this many carbons, this many oxygens. And then I believe Raphael elucidated the chemical structure in 67 or 68. Sorry, I'm just pulling it out of my memory. But yeah, prior to the 70s, we knew that cannabis was psychoactive, but we did not know what was causing that psychoactivity, which is one of the primary reasons why they assumed that was making people crazy. No, it doesn't contain sugar, it doesn't contain nicotine. We don't know what it is because it's got more carbons in it than ethanol. So let's just ban it because it must be poison. So that's obviously ignorance based on the lack of scientific understanding at the time. But over the last 50 years, we've come to better understand cannabis, its biosynthetic pathways, and we've actually been able to show that it is not only safe, but actually may be part of a quintessential equilibrium system within the body. You know, I do not think it's a coincidence that over the last 100 years, since cannabis and hemp has been banned, we've seen a explosion of neurodegenerative diseases. Because there used to be feral hemp being grown everywhere. It still grows wild in many states in the Midwest, and that feral hemp would go to feed the cows, go to feed the livestock. Those endocannabinoids would get into the livestock, get into the cow's milk, get into the meat, and it was a way that we could essentially feed our endocannabinoid system just by allowing it to grow on our farms. And that's essentially been stripped out of our farms, leading to decades of endocannabinoid deficiency within the humanity. So yeah, so back in the pre-legalization era, the only thing you could really use was really ethanol and mechanical separation, things like dry sift. So hand charas goes back a couple thousand years in the Himalayan mountains where you're rubbing buds. The silk screen dry sift production in the Middle East as well as North Africa dates back a couple of 100 years. So as they started bringing silk scarves back from the Near East through the Silk Road to the Middle East, some of that silk would actually get left in the Middle East. And then the farmers started realizing that if they broke or trimmed or broke up their buds over these silk screens, the silk would actually allow the glandular trichomes to fall through. So that led to what we know of as the hash production in places like Afghanistan and Lebanon. And then later that was moved to places like Morocco, Algeria for smuggling purposes. But up until about 50 years ago, it was primarily a mechanical separation similar to threshing of things like wheat, where we're separating the wheat or rice, where we're separating the rice kernel or the grain of grain from the bast of the plant material, removing all the plant material, and then you're left with kind of the fruit of our labor. With cannabis, it's going to be done the glandular trichomes with seeded bud, obviously glandular trichomes and seeded bud. But in places like Lebanon and Afghanistan, they would actually harvest the plants in the fall, bring them inside of their sheds or houses to dry, and then wait until the coldest part of the year. The reason why they wait till midwinter to actually start doing their sifting is because, when you think about the glandular trichome being a cap on the top of a stalk, that stalk becomes brittle as it becomes cooled. So Shredder 0911 would love to learn more about how to use some liquid nitrogen and how to best use it for dry sift safely. So liquid nitrogen is one of the things that's been developed over the last couple of years. But before we get to liquid nitrogen, we can talk about the evolution. First, it was just breaking buds up over sieves. Then I think it was in the 90s, Bubbleman, Marcus, as well as other people like Mila started producing products like the tumblers and resonators that actually allowed us to produce dry sift by allowing that bud to be broken up over screens and things like the tumblers or those flat square screens, and the trichomes essentially fall through. Well, that kind of changed when Bubbleman, a couple other guys started developing the water hash process in the 90s, where they realized that those oil-containing glandular trichomes, because of the waxy cuticle being denser than the water, if you were to thresh those glandular trichome plant material in a column of water, the biomass, because it still contains cellulose and air, is going to float, whereas the denser, higher density waxy cuticle in the glandular trichome is actually going to sink. So that was the kind of advent of bubble hash. I'm going to break the buds up in water. The glandular trichomes that contain the essential oils are going to sink to the bottom, and then we can screen it out. The biomass can float to the top. So we're dealing in that water hash or ice water sieving or bubble hash, whatever you want to call it. We're dealing with density through the mechanical sieving process to actually break the flour up and allow the trichomes, which are denser, to fall through those screens, collect on those screens of various sizes, and then discarding the biomass, which is less dense, floats on water, and can be separated using the larger micron screens. So over the last 20 years, bubble hash has been really popular. Over the last 30 years, it's been really popular. But over the last 5 or 10 years, we've kind of had a resurgence of solventless extraction. So because of things like, increasing regulation around butane over the last 5 years, as well as things like VapeGate, where people were using unapproved adulterants or additives to vape pens causing scare, many people started transitioning back to some of that traditional sieving. What's awesome about liquid nitrogen is that it's going to freeze your biomass. Liquid nitrogen boils at negative 150 degrees. So the minute you take your biomass and saturate it in liquid nitrogen, that liquid nitrogen is going to freeze that material. The nitrogen is going to boil off. It's an endothermic reaction, which means that as the liquid nitrogen's boiling off, it's absorbing all the heat from the environment, and it's chilling your biomass down to negative 150 degrees. And generally we'll get it down to about negative 60 within our tumblers. So by introducing either carbon dioxide, which chills it down to negative 60, or liquid nitrogen, which chills it down to about negative 80, you can actually flash freeze your plant biomass. And when you think about the stalk and the glandular trichome on that, is that stalk going to be more or less brittle when it's freezing cold? Well, it's going to be more able to move around if it's warm, but if it's frozen solid, it's going to be relatively easy for my screen to come along and just break that glandular trichome off. So how can we utilize liquid nitrogen and how best to use it safely? Obviously, liquid nitrogen's heavier than air, so it is an asphyxiant like carbon dioxide. If you're going to be using carbon dioxide or liquid nitrogen to sift, you need to do it in a ventilated room and have air being extracted from the room from below 4 feet, i.e. floor level ventilation. So what I would recommend if you're going to get into carbon dioxide or liquid nitrogen sifting is first get ventilation in your room. That ventilation is going to extract the air. If you do not have that ventilation in your room, you can kill yourself. So if you're not going to do it safely, don't do it at all. Once you have the ventilation, what I would start doing is looking at, okay, what are the ways that I can introduce this biomass or this nitrogen or carbon dioxide into my biomass to help flash freeze it. I've seen that done a couple of ways. There are 2 equipment manufacturers, Green Bros and the Resonator company, that actually have ports on the sides of their dry sift tumblers where you can actually plumb either carbon dioxide or liquid nitrogen to actually inject carbon dioxide or liquid nitrogen into the biomass while it's tumbling. That's going to help freeze that biomass while it's in the tumbler. Ideally, your biomass is very dry before you put it into that tumbler so that no water will essentially get extracted. And then after it's basically, you're breaking those glandular trichomes off in your carbon dioxide or liquid nitrogen or water solution, And it's then going to travel through that solution into your bubble bags or into your sieves and then get collected and filtered off. Personally, I prefer carbon dioxide because it's easier to extract out of the air than liquid nitrogen. You can buy carbon dioxide generators. You can also buy nitrogen generators. And that nitrogen generator is going to pull that nitrogen out of the air using nothing but electricity and essentially using a giant compressor to compress it into first a gas and then a liquid. Sorry, I just saw something pop up here. What was the next one? Yeah, so once you've passed your cannabinoids or your glandular trichromes into your solution, send it through the sieving, then you can actually collect those glandular trichromes on a sieve and essentially remove that material from your liquid nitrogen or dry ice. And because liquid nitrogen boils at negative 150 degrees, you don't have to purge it. Because carbon dioxide boils at negative 60 degrees, you don't have to purge it. So generally what we will do if we're going to be doing liquid nitrogen or dry sifting with carbon dioxide is, once we get the material out of the machine, we still want to let it off gas any of that residual nitrogen or carbon dioxide, but we'll allow it to off gas inside of a tray, inside of a sealed food rack in a room that still has its ventilation going. So I think that the comment was asking about water-soluble cannabinoids. So the best way to explain water-soluble cannabinoids in a way that many of the listeners are going to understand is the same way that we explain trichromes and bubble hash. So once I have an isolate, THC, the cannabinoids are generally not water-soluble, they're fat-soluble. But if I put that cannabinoid in an envelope, have the inside of that envelope be able to interact with cannabinoids, but the outside of that envelope is water soluble, I can essentially make a trichrome or what's called a misio or a liposome, essentially a microcell that's water soluble, a microbubble that's water soluble. On the inside of that bubble contains the essential oils, the cannabinoids that we are desiring. And on the outside, you have essentially a water soluble matrix. That's done a couple of different ways. So there's what's called misio-based nano cannabinoids, which basically is a single cell wall. You have essentially one layer of lipids that have a non-polar tail and a polar phospholipid head. And that phospholipid head is going to create that wall around your droplets of oil. And the smaller you can get that droplet of oil and thus the more surface area of the head, the more that you can actually make that water soluble. There's a couple other ways of doing it. One that's called liposomal, where you're actually doing multiple layers around the outside of that droplet, or chelation, which is primarily done in the nutrient industry. So everyone has heard about chelated nutrients. What you're essentially doing is taking a nutrient that doesn't like to stay suspended in water. You're making it become more soluble in water by locking it into a salt complex. And that can be done with cannabinoids as well, although I'm unfortunately restricted by NDA to be able to talk about it. So there's actually 7 different ways of making cannabinoids water soluble. The most common ones are a misio-based or liposomal based, although there's going to be a ton of innovation as we actually have funding to be able to bring that to market. Encapsulated, grows way encapsulated liposomes. So in my opinion, misio based water soluble drinks are probably going to be the most popular for a recreational market. Liposomal based is probably going to be better for the medical market because a chemist like me can actually embed proteins on the outside of those liposomes that deliver that droplet to a specific organ. So if I'm trying to treat a disease, say a liver disease, I can embed proteins on the outside of that says, hey, unzip this package when it interacts with a liver enzyme or a liver protein synthase. And then that cannabinoid is only going to be released from that liposome when it gets to that specific organ. And the FDA requires you to be able to prove you're delivering your monomolecular isolate to a specific organ group if you're going to get FDA approved. So I think liposomal cannabinoids are going to probably be the more pharmaceutical route. Misio-based will probably be the cheapest and easiest, thus the recreational route. And for long shelf stability, you'll probably look at things like chelated. But there's a bunch of different ways we could easily do that. And yes, Aldridge, generally the Misio base are going to have a phospholipid head is the best because, just like in the cell in the human body, we generally have our cells have phospholipid heads. Having those phospholipid heads actually makes it very bioavailable. Your body doesn't start to detect it and react to it nearly as well. So it becomes more bioavailable, faster uptake, and ends up having a better efficacy to the consumer. There's other things that have been used like soaps, but those end up not having the best shelf stability.
I was at the other day, they had something called HTEP. I don't know if I remember what it was, but do you want to touch on that and what that is for a minute?
Talking THCP?
No, not THCP. It was like high terpene something extract.
Oh, HTSFCE. So yeah. So we were talking earlier about going through the extraction process. The first thing that everybody was really hot and bothered trying to produce was isolated monomolecular THC. First it was shatter, right? And then it was distillate. Everyone had to have distillate. And then it became isolate because of primarily the CBD craze. What people realized when we started producing vape pens out of distillate and CBD isolate was that you don't get as high off of pure THC as you do off of the terpenes in conjunction with the cannabinoids. The reason for this is a process that Ethan Russo has written extensively about. Dr. Russo is a former neurosurgeon for GW Pharmaceutical. It's called the entourage effect. So just consuming THC is going to affect your THC receptors, but by adding those terpenes, you actually can significantly increase the efficacy of those cannabinoids. So, and there's synergistic side effects that create a cascading effect within your body when you have those terpenes. So obviously in the early days of medical and recreational, everyone wanted to produce that 100% THC. Well, we started realizing that, hey, when I'm making a 95% THC vape pen, it doesn't get me as high as this 75% vape pen that's got its terps still in it. So what we started doing first with CO2, but then later with butane, was actually trying to do what's called fractional extraction or extraction into using carbon dioxide to essentially do a fractional distillation. The first thing that we extract are the terpenes. So HTSFE, high terpene superfluid extract. And then essentially you can extract the terpenes from your cannabinoid biomass and then do a secondary extraction called HCSFE, so high cannabinoid superfluid extract. And essentially what you can do is extract your terpenes first, then your cannabinoids. If you wanted, you could take your cannabinoids, reintroduce your terpenes, and have a high terpene crude extract. But what many of the vape pen producers were doing was they were realizing that, hey, this high cannabinoid fraction, when I winterize it and then boil off the ethanol, I'm going to lose all the terpenes that boil off below ethanol's boiling point. So it's not going to have those monoterpenes that give it its really light, delicate floral layer. But if I separate the terpenes first and take the cannabinoid fractions and send a cannabinoid fraction that has its waxes, has the lipids, has the carotenoids that give it its color, send that through winterization distillation in the case of vape pens, then I can essentially remove all the impurities on this later fraction, reintroduce this terpene fraction, and now I have a distillate with this strain specific terpenes in it that taste much closer to the cannabis flower tastes than if I were to add botanical terpenes to that distillate. So the first couple of groups that were doing that, I think, were based out of Washington, California, and Oregon. But it became a lot more popular as the distillate vape pens started flooding the market. And then once I could have distillate vape pens in every store and those markets, then all of a sudden it was like, hey, okay, we got the moonshine, but most people don't drink moonshine, they drink wine. So let's go ahead and not have a 95% THC. Let's come out with a 50 or 60 or 70% THC that's got 10 to 30% terpenes in it, and produce a vape pen that actually tastes like the flower. So what they would do is, once we had the kind of isolate of the cannabinoids fraction, then 2015 through 2020, then it was like, okay, we know how to produce monomolecular isolates. How can we build on that monomolecular isolates by taking advantage of the entourage effect of those terpenes? And we're going to start to see that in the federally regulated markets, as well as many of the new markets. When I go to consulting trips or business trips out to the East Coast, many of those states that are 1 or 2 years into legalization, they primarily have distillate on the market. Even here in Canada, federal legalization went into effect 2019. You could have extracts in 2020. So I think it's now 2022 that you now have live resin vape pens. And then, there's only 2 or 3 live resin vape pens in the BC market. I don't think that anybody's producing high terpene SFE vape pens yet. There is 2 groups working on rosin vape pens. So as the industry evolves, all of a sudden everyone realized, hey, I can't just sell this distillate. If I'm going to sell this distillate, it's going to be like the malt liquor industry. It's going to be kind of our lower grade economy product. But if I want to be able to have a $20, a $40, and a $60 product portfolio, you have to be able to have something cheap for the gas station, something decent for the consumers, as well as a premium product for the connoisseurs. In the case of vape pens, you got distillate, you got high terpene extracts, generally solvent extracted, and then you got solventless vape pens, which are the mythical unicorn in many of the developed markets. Same with dabbables, right? Early days, it was just a kind of a low terpene content wax or shatter. And then all of a sudden we could kind of have that intermediate, what's called live resin, where we freeze the material before it's dried, extract it, maintain that monoterpene floral bouquet because we're doing our extraction cold and not drying it. And then getting that in the market with almost 2 to 3 times as much terpenes as the early days of shatter. More recently in Canada, it took almost 2 years in Canada to have the first live rosins and live resins in the market. Now, what I'm seeing when I talk to retail stores is that, hey, every time I get a high quality product, even though it costs twice as much as the discount product, it sells out. So as consumers become more educated, they tend to buy the best quality product that their budget allows. Now we're going into a lot of economists are thinking we're going into a recession, so you'll probably see more consumer trends go towards a lower cost product. But as we ebb and flow in and out of recessions and economic booms, we always want to try and maintain, like, hey, here's our cheap stuff, here's our cheap product, and then here's our high-end rosin. That way we can have our $2 truck, our micro beers, as well as our kind of premium champagnes. So
awesome. let me see here. We've actually gone through a bunch of the things I was going to ask you about. I did have a question about, so there's a absolutely ludicrous, it's like the number of CBD licenses kind of went off a cliff this year. There's like, I think a little over 2,000 licenses now, or something around 2,000, where it used to be almost 70. Do you think the price of CBD flower is going to go up this year with a huge reduction in production, or is it scaling to where it's going to be about the same?
How do I put this delicately? I think we're more likely to see THC flower commodification, so that there will always be low quality biomass. There will always be higher quality biomass. There will always be people trying to buy CBD hemp for $20 a pound. There will be consumers willing to pay over $1,000 a pound, whether it's THC or CBD. So here in Canada, we don't actually have a lot of CBD being cultivated because there's a pedigreed seed program. So the only people allowed to cultivate CBD here in Canada are the LPs. So Canada is actually inverse to the US. So I'll talk about the US real quick, and then I'll kind of talk about Canada, and then we'll come back to both. So yeah, when I first started extracting CBD, there weren't a lot of people doing it. I think I was one of the first 5 groups in Colorado that were isolating dry sift and turning it into distillate. When Oregon passed, we had a ton of people start building labs in Oregon because they thought it was a way to get out of the recreational industry that was already flooded in Oregon. And I want to say in 2014, Oregon had ounces of cannabis for $40 an ounce. And many of these recreational farmers couldn't produce cannabis and sell it at a profit. So they started transitioning out of the recreational space, cutting their losses and realizing, hey, I'm not really making a lot of money growing THC, but I can grow 100 acres of CBD and ship it across the US. And that's exactly what they did. They got in the CBD space, they started producing it. If they were smart, they got a sales license from their state, built business connections with salespeople throughout the US, produced a federally compliant CBD isolate or manufactured product, and then built the network to start exporting that across the US, or if they were even smarter, exporting it to other countries with limited imports. As that became popular in the 2015, 2016, 2017, 2018 time, and then with the passage of the Farm Bill, all of a sudden the number of hemp producers exploded. That led to commodification within the price. More farmers planted hemp than there was processing capacity. I'd love to process all the hemp for all the farmers. Unfortunately, I cannot raise money fast enough to build labs that can meet the demands for the farmers. And for that matter, I cannot build labs fast enough to keep up with the demand of the countries trying to import US CBD monomolecular isolates. So there's still, even though there's a glut of CBD in the US, there is a massive global shortage of CBD available. The problem is many of those US companies haven't gone through the process to learn, or haven't gone through the permitting process to be able to export CBD or CBD manufactured products to places like South America, Europe, or Asia. There's a few groups that are primarily ones that are a lot better funded, have lawyers sitting on their boards, that sort of stuff. But yeah, we saw a green rush of people thinking that they were going to make all their money off of CBD. But the reality is that CBD and THC are an agricultural commodity, just like hops, just like tobacco. And I don't want to scare everybody, but by the time that you're dealing with publicly traded companies that I'm competing against, they can lose $20 million a season without even batting an eye or firing an executive. So I think it's far wiser to focus on producing a champagne that you can sell as a premium product and is going to maintain its price than trying to produce a $2 truck that's going to have to compete on the global market against the commodification of the prices. So while I've built labs that are doing both and consulting groups that are doing both, what I've seen is that the companies that are producing a premium product, growing organic flower, producing quality extracts that have high terpene contents, they're able to sell their product and they can't keep it in stock. The people that are trying to go for maximum production, minimizing the cost, put it out the door, they end up having a glut of product in their inventory and end up having to sell it at an ever increasing loss. Sorry, just getting
No worries.
getting texted by the wifey. I got to respond. So yeah, I think there's a global shortage of CBD, but there's a glut within the US. That glut within the US led to the price commodification. The price crashed dramatically. I remember when we were selling kilos of CBD isolate for 40 grand, then it went down to 20. I think it's what, $300-400 a kilo on the wholesale if you're buying it in bulk, a couple grand, under a grand if you're buying single kilos. But if you're selling a GMP, EU GMP accredited kilo of isolate, I know people that are still getting $2,000 to $5,000 a kilo, while their competitors selling the exact same potency, exact same CBD isolate that comes from a non-GMP accredited facility are selling it at a tenth as much. The same is true here in Canada. Canada, we don't have the massive glut of CBD hemp because the hemp farmers are primarily growing it for seed. Some hemp growers are growing it for fiber, and a very small percentage of farmers are growing CBD for CBD hemp for CBD extraction. So we don't really have the glut of CBD here in Canada, but we got federal recreational cannabis. And when I look at the federal production numbers as opposed to the amount of cannabis sold over the last year, I can say that 6 times as much cannabis has been produced in Canada over the last year as has been sold. What's that mean? The entire country of Canada could stop growing weed and we have enough weed to get through the next recession because there's so much of it grown. Now, I'll be honest, as somebody who had to go look and source that material for some of the larger labs, not everything's as dank as all the customers want. In fact, the majority of the cannabis being produced out of these newly built facilities takes time to dial your facility in. So the first couple of crops are going to be subpar product. And then as you run a couple of cycles, you get your grow room dialed in, you get your nutrients dialed in, you get your environmental dialed in, you get your genetics dialed in, you start to produce a better quality product. But there has been a massive glut of THC cannabis here in Canada. This has not been helped by the provincial distribution boards. So here in Canada, there's actually a federal monopoly on distribution. In many of the provinces, with a few exceptions, I have to sell everything that I produce to a province who then sells it to the retail stores, which means I can't build a rapport with the retail store right down the street and say, hey, bro, I just got this new lot. It's just tested. I'm ready to package it. You're going to be the only shop carrying it, exclusive drop. Can't do that. I literally have to go convince the entire government or the provincial distribution board, say, hey, if you carry this at your 400 government shops and the other couple hundred more non-government privately owned shops, it's going to sell well. There's a small handful of decision makers on what becomes available in the Canadian market. And because of that, you have, fairly large producers getting products into market. But for what are here in Canada are called the micro producers, it has become extremely difficult to be able to supply the market. And if, for example, I get an order from a big province, if that product sells out because I just had to sell to an entire province instead of a single store, and I cannot immediately restock that product, what's that provincial distribution board going to do? they're going to pull my product from the shelves. So so the game here in Canada somewhat favors the big publicly traded companies that then essentially flood the market with lower quality product. And it becomes a lot harder for the traditional growers that produce the fire. There's some of the best cannabis in the world I've had has been here in Canada, but it's harder for them to bring that product to market because there are monopolistic distribution gates where I should be able to go to the 50 retail stores in Vancouver, find 20 of them that actually have the same values as I do, get them to carry my product, and then on the cheaper end products, we'll sell them to the cheaper stores. On the higher end products, we'll sell them to the high end stores. But having that provincial monopoly has made a massive impediment for many of the small producers to come to market. That's led to an oversupply within the Canadian market. The Canadian cannabis prices have fallen significantly from where they were even just a year ago. I want to say that Canadian growers in the micro space were getting paid up to $4 a gram. I've heard numbers ranging as low as 8 cents a gram, all the way up to about 40 cents a gram on product that they should be getting between $1 and $3.50 per gram. And if they didn't have that monopolistic distribution, those farmers probably would be getting paid 2 to 3 times as much. So it's really tough here in Canada. But what we've actually seen is that provincial monopoly, as well as the overproduction, has led to a severe commodification within the industry. And as a consumer, that's kind of a good thing. Like back in the day of medical and even black market, I couldn't buy hash for under $20 a gram. I can tell you right now, there are producers in the Canadian market that are selling 2 grams of hash for under $20. Generally, I'm still spending in that $40 to $60 range because that's what my budget allows. But I'm still been able to get a solventless extract here in Canada for $40 to $60, whereas in the medical or in the black market, it may have costed me $50 to $100. So now we have weed that's cheaper than the black market. It's arguably better because it's tested and taxed. But it's continually improving because the smaller companies that were able to produce the quality but didn't have the financial backing to push it into the market by hiring 50 people to fill out all the paperwork, those smaller companies, it takes longer to get into market. But since they're producing a better quality product, they're able to produce product that ends up having higher customer retention. So more people, if I have something that's a 5-star hash as opposed to a 3-star hash, I'm going to smoke that 3-star hash if I'm broke and can't pay my bills. But if I'm doing good, if my companies are doing good, I'm going to buy that premium product because I'm trying to brag to the cute girls that I'm smoking with. So yeah, I've seen $10 to $40 grams in RSO in Maine, says Jim Owen. I think that we're going to see in our lifetime, Steve, you and I are about the same age. I think you're going to be able to see packs of pre-rolls cheaper than cigarettes. I think you're going to see vape pens cheaper than cigarettes in our lifetime. Because to be honest, I'd rather sell a THC vape pen for $10 a unit than have people buying a pack of cigarettes for $10 a pack. It's arguably healthier. We still need to do a lot of the research on that, but I would say that it's healthier, it's less harmful carcinogens. But
So I had another question for you as far as decarb. Now, I managed back when I used to live in Philly, we used to decarb in mason jars to kind of keep from stinking up the apartment complex. And then we realized we were getting better potency, decarbing in a sealed container, and kind of ran with that. And then I know a lot of people are kind of moving that direction with either doing it in a kind of like a sous vide in a backpack bag, or doing it in a sealed mason jar and a pressure cooker. What are your thoughts on the different decarb methods, and what do you like as far as stuff that people might be able to use if they're trying to help someone that they know make some medicine?
So you learn to protect the terps, eh?
Yeah, this is
Yeah.
back in the day,
So
and back in the hood, back there growing up in Philly, like if you
hot
cook
box in your
off a
apartment can
couple
draw the
pounds
heat,
of
bro.
weed, like the whole block knows that you're cooking off a couple pounds of weed, right? Like it's just loud. So you
Yeah.
gotta
So
you gotta
so what
find a
we're
way to
talking
do something
about
about
is a
it.
process called reflux in the distillation game. So by sealing that jar, you're not allowing oxygen into it. You're reducing the amount of oxygen available to actually oxidize the terpenes, allowing the terpenes to volatilize. Thus, when the terpenes boil, they essentially boil, condense on the lid, reliquefy, fall back in. There's going to be a little bit of thermal degradation, but you're not going to lose those terpenes like you would if you had an open vessel. So when you're looking at entourage, um, I love being able to decarboxylate my broad spectrum cannabis extracts in a sealed vessel. Generally, it's a mason jar. I've seen people use the sous vides because there's been cases where the mason jar heated, you get enough thermal expansion that it'll cause the mason jar to break. So that putting it in a sous vide bag, it just kind of adds as a protective layer. But yeah,
Just on a quick note, I do have guide videos on. Sorry about the cat and the dog playing. I do have guide videos on both of those techs on my YouTube channel. They're actually two of my top 10 most viewed videos per week. So if anyone is wanting to learn more about that, there are how-tos on that.
nice. Yeah, and to be honest, that's probably one of the better ways of doing it is sealed vessel decarboxylation for terpene retention. Unless if you're trying to produce a edible that doesn't taste like weed. If you have a customer, a family member that doesn't really like the taste of weed, then you may want to try and oxidize and boil those off or turn it into a distillate. But for the majority of consumers that are okay with the taste of weed, being able to preserve those terpenes are going to make your product more efficacious just from the entourage effect.
I've also found that apple sugar, for whatever reason, seems to do a pretty good job of neutralizing that kind of like heavier, resiny, ashier kind of flavor to the stuff. So if you're trying to go at home, that's something you can get at any grocery store. It definitely helps. But you do need to have a good emulsifier. Spending a couple extra bucks on a sonicator emulsifier will make a huge difference in the quality of what you're making.
Yeah, for
You want to
sure.
touch on that on emulsifiers for a minute, or the different equipment? Is that a little?
Yeah. So what should I talk about there? So yeah, once we have the cannabis into our extracted state, many of the companies are looking at either producing it into a edible or a formulated product. In general, if you're just turning it into an edible, you can infuse it into either a sugar or a fat, and then take that sugar or fat and mix it into your edible. So, things like chocolate, you can put it into the butter. And many of the baked goods, you can just infuse it into the sugar. My wife loves making maple candy. So infusing maple syrup, slowly boiling off the water, and then essentially turning it into an infused fudge. Um, this is your decarboxylation step. Yeah. So the what we have going on here is basically the biomass is getting put into bags, and then we're essentially boiling the biomass in that bag. Because the water is boiling, it's sitting at 100 centigrade, which is roughly 212 Fahrenheit. So the decarboxylation is going to start at about 135 Fahrenheit. So in a bag like this, Steve, what are you doing between 3 and 6 hours for the
Everything
decarboxylation?
like that. This is really
Yeah.
So in
interesting.
this video, I
So
think we
what you want
did
to
two
do
and a
is
half.
take your
But yeah,
Okay.
a big old
Yeah.
I
So
guess I did a little longer, but we did about 2.5 hours in that. And you could also buy a sous vide and throw them in like a beer cooler or whatever, and do it the same way at home if you're trying to find like a lower tech method.
yeah,
Great for cooking
totally.
steaks too.
Totally. Um, Yeah, the other thing that I would just do is honestly put the flower in a jar and put it in an oven like you're doing right here actually. So you're just kind of pre-baking it, and then you're able to decarb your material in its floral form. Uh, so generally speaking, with decarboxylation, there's going to be three factors that go into it: the amount of oxygen that's present, the amount of heat, and the amount of UV light. So with this, we're primarily using heat, but there are other ways you can decarboxylate at lower temperatures without having the thermal degradation, just by essentially what's called asperging oxygen through those canisters. Then you can use less heat, but you'll end up getting more oxidization of the terpenes.
What I like to do too is I'll take those, and if I'm going to do this for butter or oil infusion for someone I'm trying to help, especially if I have a bunch of leftover rosin pucks from making hash rosin, I love to use that stuff for making this stuff, especially if I'm going to give it out to people that are really hurting or need it for cancer stuff or whatever else that is really heavy kind of treatments. We'll take this, put it all in a mason jar, decarb it, and then take that and fill it maybe 40 or 50% of the way in the jars rather than as much as we did in the video. Sorry about the cat in the background. He wants to get out. I'll let him out in a second. Anyways, and then so what we'll do is we'll fill them about 40-50% of the way, and then we'll decarb it, and then we'll take those out, put them in the fridge, and then we'll take those, open them after about 2 or 3 hours, cooling down, pour in our hot melted butter or oil into there, and then put those back into a pressure cooker and cook them that way. And that's been really good for as far as like a home tech kind of method.
Yeah, totally. So, yeah, what I actually like doing for my home edibles is generally I'm making hash at home regardless. So what I'll do is I'll make my plant material either a dry sift or bubble hash. Generally a dry sift with my home. Take the biomass that's already been sifted, and I generally like to do an oil extraction with it. So take the plant matter that's been sifted. I know that I've removed greater than 50% of the cannabinoids into the sift, but there's still going to be some residual cannabinoids left in that biomass. I'll take that biomass, put it into a jar, put that jar into an oven, anywhere from an hour to 3 hours, depending on how decarbed I want it to be, how much THCA versus THC. And then I'll actually fill that jar with oil or alcohol, but my wife likes to cook, so I generally use hemp seed oil. And then we will do an oil extraction, let it sit in generally cool, dark place for as long as possible if we're doing a THCA extraction, or if I'm doing a THC extraction, I'll take the biomass that's been partially decarbed, fill it with oil, put it in a sous vide, let the sous vide run heated. That heated oil is going to extract the cannabinoids a little bit faster than if you're just letting it room temp, but you are going to get progressive decarboxylation. I'm also a huge fan of THCA. So my wife and I both, when it's summer months and we're cultivating, we're actually harvesting those leaves a couple times a week. We go through and we prune all our leaves, make it into a salad, make it into a smoothie, or juice it. And you can actually get some of those polyphenols, terpenes, and cannabinoids extracted into your juice, into that dark green juice that comes out. It looks like wheatgrass shots. Now, the nice part is that it's THCA dominant. It hasn't been heated. So until it actually gets absorbed, passes through your liver, and metabolized into 11-hydroxy-THC, its THCA is significantly less intoxicating than THC, but it has wonderful energizing effect. So, as somebody who works in a chemistry lab, when I'm dealing with relatively dangerous chemicals day in and day out, I generally try and avoid being stoned at work, but I will consume CBD or THCA in order to prevent my medical issues. And what I found is that by consuming THCA and CBD, I can get all of that medical efficacy without actually having the delayed reaction times and basically intoxication that's caused by the THC. Dactic mods, yes, acids will cause decarboxylation. Stomach acids do have chemical interaction with the cannabinoids, but what you're really thinking about is that within your liver, there's a couple of enzymes that'll convert the THC into a molecule called 11-hydroxy THC. So 11-hydroxy THC is a form of THC that's essentially been metabolized within your body. And anecdotal reports actually are showing that 11-hydroxy THC to be a little bit more psychedelic, where it actually is increasing visual acuity, color sensitivity, color saturation, whereas THC and THCA are generally viewed as more of the kind of stony effects. So I like THC because it primarily affects my peripheral nervous system. THC affects my central nervous system. And I get slower thoughts. 11-hydroxy THC is nice because as it converts, after I eat an edible, as it converts into 11-hydroxy THC, I get the benefits of the THC in the peripheral nervous system, but I don't get the slowed down mental processes that oftentimes happen. And yes, it is a form of isomerization. And Chad, you're spot on. The magic happens in the liver. Does anyone know if Delta 8 turns into 11-hydroxy THC? Yes, does. Delta 8, Delta 9, all can be converted into 11-hydroxy THC. There's some other side reactions that I won't go into, but next time we have Dr. Mark, I'll have him come. We can have him on and explain. But yeah, you can produce. You can produce not only 11-hydroxy THC, but Delta 6, Delta 9, and Delta 8 THC through isomerization. So
I had something I wanted to share with you. Hold on, I'm switching internets here a second. There we go. Hopefully my internet's more stable now. So this was CBD crystals grown in grapeseed oil with sonicated CBD rosin.
oh, nice. So yeah, it's just super saturated the oil.
Yep, super hypersaturated the grapeseed oil with CBD rosin, and then sonicated it until
Yeah, so grapeseed oil generally has a lower molecular weight. That's why it likes to stay at room temperature. That's really pretty crystallization.
It's the cleanest as far as non, I guess, something that you could do rosin to crystal. It's the cleanest method I've found so far, and something that's kind of pure and organic and something kind of neat and different I wanted to kind of share.
That's a beautiful lattice structure.
Yeah, hold on, I'll pull up some more pictures.
Yeah, so generally speaking, guys, listeners, the smaller the crystalline lattice, the harder it is to get what's called impurities included into those crystals. So as I'm growing a diamond, as I get that diamond bigger and bigger and bigger, it's easier to get inclusions in that diamond of potential impurities. By having a larger molecular weight oil that's closer to the molecular weight of THC, as you supersaturate it, you can produce that what's called pinnately structured crystalline structure. So it produces that much more lacy crystalline structure. Did you screen that out? Oh, nice. Yeah. So you can see that here it's kind of growing along a relatively long unilateral crystalline structure. Whereas if you were to do that same thing in an alkene, as the alkene boil, it's going to pack it in much more of a faceted, looking more like a diamond. So did you filter that out of the oil later?
Yeah. We cleaned it and it came out really nice.
Did it come out like a
Really
what's that
clear,
called?
like
Yeah,
super.
super clear, right? Glassy.
Yeah, really
Yeah.
glassy. Like the glassiest. Here's a different batch, and you can kind of see um, how it drops out with the heavier oils at the bottom
Yeah, totally.
and crystals on top before we
That's
wash.
awesome.
Yeah, it's just kind of a different tech. I was trying to kind of figure out something that you could take from CBD rosin to do kind of a cleaner separation, and still kind of keep it, relatively organic certified inputs.
That's cool. Um,
Just a weird hippie tech, not, I don't I have no idea how useful it is, but it's kind of cool.
yeah. So I see a comment on YouTube chat looking for a pathway from Delta 8 to CBN if possible. It is possible. There's a couple different ways. So just reading your comments, juice all the time. So it sounds like this user, that sick mods, is producing CBD. That CBD is then being put into a vape pen. CBD likes to crystallize, form crystalline structures. CBDA less so. So what many of these CBD producers are doing is producing it into a CBD distillate, then recrystallizing that distillate into an isolate. That way it's zero THC. Problem is once it's CBD, it really likes to form that crystalline structure. And when you put it into a vape pen with terpenes, as you vaporize the terpenes out of the vape pen, the terpenes will actually evaporate before the CBD will. So your terpene content of the vape pen decreases at a faster rate than the cannabinoids, causing that supersaturation and crystallization. There are a couple ways of making it less likely to form a crystalline lattice. But for your question, can Delta 8 or Delta 9 or CBD be converted into CBN? There's a couple ways. There's an enzymatic way, a chemical process using iodine, as well as what I'll talk about for being the easiest method is heat. So energetically speaking, when I talk about thermally degrading cannabinoids, THCA is relatively easy to convert into THC using heat. It's a lot harder to convert THC back into THCA. The same thing is true with converting the neutral cannabinoids, CBD or THC, into CBN. So in the presence of light, in the presence of oxygen, in the presence of UV light, UVC, THC will slowly degrade into CBN. So if you're in a market and that market specifically desires a more narcotic, sedating cannabis vape pen, what you can actually do is convert your THC or CBD distillate into CBN using heat. Probably the easiest way of doing it is using heat. You do lose a lot of the THC or CBD in the process of thermal degradation, but there's been a couple groups I've worked with that are basically converting THC, taking CBD and THC from hemp, obviously getting CBD to a point of an isolate. What do we do with all the THC that's extracted from the CBD? Can't sell it as THC. But if we convert that CBD into CBN, now I have CBN that's derived from hemp. Or as kind of mentioned in a different comment, convert that THC into Delta 8 THC. That's technically Delta 8 THC. Depending on how much you've paid your lawyers, may not be federally regulated and may be a loophole that you want to exploit.
I was just going to say, isn't THC still technically allowed for edibles as long as it's no more than 0.3% of the weight of the volume of the whole product? So as long as 0.3% or less of the total weight of the brownie or cookie or whatever. I know there's
Yeah,
quite
if you got 100-gram brownie, you could have 2.9 grams of THC distillate in it.
It's 2,900 milligrams.
That's a massive loophole that, to be honest, I don't want to pay the lawyers to represent me on if that becomes a federal case. So yes, there, and in Washington State, they've actually passed a law called CHABA, the Cannabis Health and Beauty Aids Law. So if you're a regulated producer in Washington State, you can actually take CBD and THC, make them into topicals or body care products, cannabis health and beauty aids. And as long as the lotion contains less than 0.3% THC, you can sell that THC and CBD lotion at a grocery store. So, that's something trying to stay on this side of the bars. I generally
It's certainly a great market for sure. I just wanted to, as it's
yeah,
currently, that how is it is currently being defended. There was recently a court case that
and similar to Delta 8, many companies have started producing and distributing Delta 8 THC because it is a derivative of industrial hemp, and the lawyers that they've paid have correctly told them that if it's derived from CBD, if it's derived from hemp, and as long as it is hemp derived, it is likely fine. They're probably correct. There is a potential for the DEA using what's called the Analog Drug Act to charge every Delta 8 producer with THC manufacturing. The reason why I don't expect that to happen is because what's called they don't want to let the cat out of the bag, right? So there was here in Canada.
Down that road, THCO has a much bigger precedence. If they're going to crack down on something, that's what they're going to crack down first, because there's already federal cases that have been prosecuted on that particular extract going back at least 20 years.
Yeah.
Versus all the other derivatives do not have federal cases going back 20 years. That one does. That's the reason why I always warn people, do not touch that one if you're getting into commercial stuff.
Well, and it's extraction as well as manufacturing to produce acetate, right?
Well, yeah, so, I was just gonna say some of the precursors you need are not
heavily regulated
to come by and highly regulated.
Yeah. So, even though it's something that you could certainly pay a lawyer to argue and would make a great legal case that could potentially change the law on a federal level, it's something that many people are willing to kind of try to thread that needle. And as your company grows larger, you're going to want to take less of those risks, right? So I try and, especially with the publicly traded companies I work with, we try to thread the needle, knowing that we're staying well within the guidelines. However, for a small company looking to start up that wants to become a potential acquisition target, those are those loopholes that you want to exploit, develop that brand awareness, develop that product line, get it into market, pray, hope, and advocate your way so that you don't get charged, educate the regulators, educate the legislators so that they can pass laws that bring you into the legal industry so that we don't have to worry about going to federal case. Now, here in Canada, Canada's whole medical and recreational program were built on federal cases. So here in Canada, there's actually a constitutional right to be able to consume medicine for humans. It's essentially been determined to be a constitutional right. So back in, I think, the early 90s, there was actually a case where a terminally ill medical patient got arrested for consuming cannabis, and I believe it was called the Allard case.
It was decided in 2004 because that was the first time I went to Montreal. It was the summer legalization when they ruled on all that stuff.
Yeah,
unless
totally
it's different than what you're talking about.
Nope, you're spot on. So what ended up happening was they tried to arrest this guy, Allard. John Connery, the lawyer, represented him and basically said, hey, A, he's a terminal patient. B, he's deriving medical benefit from consuming this herb. So even though you have passed a law to ban cannabis, by banning cannabis, you've infringed upon his constitutionally afforded rights by not allowing him access to a plant-derived medicine. So even though weren't laws in place, it effectively de facto legalized medical cannabis because the federal government lost that court case. A couple of years later, they ended up passing the regulations to start regulating medical. And then later on, after the cat got out of the bag, they realized, hey, we've got to regulate this. And we can't just regulate it on a caregiver status or a home grower status. We got to start regulating companies. And that opened up the door to legalization. Same things happened with other ethnobotanical plants and drugs, psychedelic drugs. In the last 2 years, there was a court case where somebody was using, I believe, mushrooms. But now tied into the court case has been mushrooms, I believe coca, cactus, psychedelic cacti, all ethnobotanical plants. And basically these Native American churches said, hey, you can't ban this because it's constitutional infringement upon my religious rights to be able to consume these ethnobotanical plants. Here in Vancouver, BC, and throughout Canada, but primarily here in BC is what I've seen. There are now mushroom dispensaries. There are cafes you can go into and buy psychedelic cactus or coca bushes, coca leaf bushes. Now you can't buy extracted cocaine, you can't buy extracted psilocybin, you can't buy extracted heroin. But according to that court case, it became illegal for the Canadian government to prohibit the plants that produce those ethnobotanical plants. It only becomes after that court case was won. The only thing that the government could arrest people for was the actual extraction, manufacturing, and distribution and sale without a federal license. So here in Canada, you can grow mushrooms and coca and cacti, use it for your own religious use. Actually, this week, the government of Canada announced that British Columbia is going to be starting in 2023. They're going to be doing a trial project for probably 2 years, where every citizen and resident of British Columbia can possess up to 2.5 grams of cocaine, MDMA, meth, mushrooms, and opiates. So pretty much any psychedelic or hard drug, you can now have up to 2.5 grams on. Now, I'm not a huge fan of some of those drugs. I do enjoy psychedelics, but I have far too active of a head to be consuming most of those stimulants. But I think that the biggest danger to the casual drug consumer is the regulations itself. So at the start of Corona, the government of Canada closed down the borders, and it became exceedingly difficult for drug smugglers to start bringing drugs into the country. What ended up happening was people started cutting their drugs with more dangerous adulterants, many times cutting things like opiates or cocaine with things like fentanyl. And since the start of Corona, the pandemic, there's actually been an exponential increase in overdoses because of the lack of clean drug supply to the drug consumer communities. Hey.
Magical mushroom luchador.
Yeah.
That was in Vancouver.
that on the beach? You go up to the beach for 420?
Festival on 420, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But
Awesome.
that was amazing. Magical mushroom luchadors.
Yeah, totally. Now, ironically enough, you actually mentioned 151 for mushroom extract. I like ethanolic tinctures of mushrooms. There's also a great way that I heard you can extract mushrooms from Paul Stamets.
I've heard the ice water tech, and then I've had good luck with the 70% ethanol, 30% water tech.
Yeah, that's what I found is that the tinctures have the longest shelf stability because of the alcohol. But if you're going to be consuming it in a relatively short fashion, the ice water probably has the most efficacy short term. So what Paul Stamets mentioned in one of his videos is actually doing essentially a bubble hash extraction, but taking ground mushrooms, burying it in ice. As that ice melts, the water will actually extract the psilocin, psilocybin out, and then you can essentially refreeze that water, make blue ice cubes, and as he says, bring your blue ice cubes to Burning Man. Alternatively, you could hypothetically vacuum distill off your water or your ethanolic concentration, or go through a slightly modified acid-base extraction to produce a purified psilocin, psilocybin isolate crystalline structure. So, and yes, Paul is the man.
Giving away all the good secrets.
Yeah, well, and he's
That's just teasing. I actually met him for the first time down at the Need to Grow premiere. That was super cool.
You know what? If Paul giving away his secret saves the bees, we just might save the human. He may be the savior of humanity, right?
Oh no, I was just joking on that point.
I'm not. So, what do I think about using inoculated rice and not full body fruits in his tinctures? I feel the same way about using inoculated grains to grow mushrooms as I do about using hydroponics to grow cannabis. So yes, technically, according to the chemist in me, if I grow hydroponic nutrients, rock wool plants, I can grow cannabis. Looking historically at the analytical results of hydroponically grown cannabis as opposed to cannabis grown in a biodynamic soil, generally speaking, the more biodynamic the soil is, the more beneficial bacteria contributing to the microbiome, the greater concentration of terpenes and polyphenols there are. So, can you produce mushrooms using grain, rice? Absolutely. Is it still producing those beneficial polyphenols that are very beneficial and used? Yes. In my personal opinion, and I have not done the analytical documentation to prove this, but in my personal opinion, a mushroom cultivated in a forest, in its natural occurring habitat, on its natural occurring substrate, whether it be a log or whatever, manure, I think that it's going to, because it's closer to its where it evolved, it's going to have a greater source of those terpenoid precursors or polyphenol precursors, allowing to the wild cultured mushrooms or cannabis to produce a more biodiverse, thus more efficacious mushroom. It's going to have more of those compounds that we're specifically looking for.
Not even that. I think it works similar to cannabis. Mushrooms have triterpenes, and then same way that cannabis has regular terpenes, and they produce more when they have that more biodiverse stuff to defend against. That's, for instance, why the older living mushrooms are better for your own immune health, because they have to live a lot longer. They have to defend against a lot more different types of species. It's the same kind of thinking. Down that space.
Yeah, and while the psilocybin content actually goes down from small mushrooms to maturity, those tricyclic terpenoids actually goes up. So and to be honest, that's something that needs to be researched at a university level. I can do extractions on many different types of mushrooms. However, in order to actually quantify, make medical claims, what needs to be done is, and I hate to say this because it's a ton of work, university researchers need to be able to take those mushrooms, I hate to say this, isolate in each individual compound, do the research to say, hey, here's what this compound does, here's what this compound does, this compound does, all the way across the board, and then go through and say, hey, here's what we know that these groups of compounds do, these groups of compounds do, these groups of compounds do. We find this group and this group in this class of mushrooms, etc. So we can start to infer that, hey, this class of mushrooms is going to contain this and this and this, probably best for this class of medical conditions, etc., depending on the types of mushrooms. Same thing's going to be.
I wish so bad they would allow for the synergistic type of testing, because you know just as well as I do, many of these terpenes, once you start to combine them, behave completely differently in terms of efficacy, and it gets, you know, hard to kind of say, well, this plus this does this, but if you combine them, it does this other thing, and that's when it gets kind of weird. How do you explain that to people that have such a
So
narrow way of thinking? It's so frustrating.
the best way to explain it is that the nutraceuticals and herbal supplements are probably going to be more efficacious than the pharmaceutical isolates. So, you know, we've talked earlier about the entourage effect. There's going to be a variety of terpenes that actually can make cannabis more efficacious. The same thing is going to be true with the mushrooms. You know, even though there's a couple of key compounds that we may be looking for, that complex biodiverse the fungal terpinome is going to actually allow for a much more efficacious thing. Now, with that said, there's levels to the game, right? The FDA and the pharmaceutical industry and the whole insurance industry in and of itself has really been regulated to a point that they're real monomolecular focused. However, the nutraceutical industry and the herbal supplement industry are industries that aren't as heavily regulated as the pharmaceutical industry and do allow the complexity of entourage and all the variety of active compounds. So I am a big proponent of a, you know, relatively organic lifestyle, and having a biodynamic diet, as well as having, you know, I personally would prefer to treat myself using herbs than using pharmaceuticals. However, there's a, you know, somebody who's in the hospital, doctors are going to prefer to use as monomolecular. So there's going to be kind of spectrums. I think the everyday recreational consumer looking at wellness should be looking at herbal supplements as that, you know, wellness looks at, okay, I'm going to try and, you know, treat some of my conditions by myself. Then you start talking to a nutritionalist and maybe a homeopathic doctor who can supplement your herbal supplements with some sort of nutraceutical. And then if that doesn't work, then we start getting the chemists involved in getting into the pharmaceutical realm. So I'm a big fan of that nutraceutical and herbal supplement side. For the people that are actually interested in it, there's a great paper that's called Traversing the Fungal Terpinome. Yeah, terpinome. I got it actually on my internet, so excuse me while I turn off my camera for a second. I'll pull it up, give you the author's name. So yeah, you can easily access this online on NCIB, but Traversing the Fungal Terpinome by Maureen Quinn, Christopher Flynn, and Claudette Schmidt-Dannert is a great paper that actually talks about how different fungi are producing different terpenes, different polyphenols in a very similar method to the way that cannabinoids are producing terpenes. So Steve, I see you put the link to that in the YouTube chat. So yeah, feel free. And same with you, Sir Dirty. Thank you guys very much. And then, yeah, Chad, you mentioned the 2011 Taming the THC. That actually is a paper written by Dr. Russo et al., a couple other authors. And what that talked about was, you know, hey, here's what THC can do, but here's what all the other terpenes within the cannabis plant can do.
So last on the show, you graced us with some super cool knowledge about how there was kind of a correlation between PM and CBL, I believe it was. Do you have any other insights into some of the different things that you've seen and correlations with some of the weirder cannabinoids?
Yeah, so I haven't been able to do a lot of research on the enzymatic degradation of the cannabinoids recently, but I have actually been doing some research on photonics. So there was this talk a couple years ago that I heard at the Emerald Cup that really piqued an interest in one of the things that was said. And essentially what I believe it was SC Labs was doing a high level GIS study on all the entries to the Emerald Cup. And what they had found was that, I think it was 2017 or 2018 that they did this paper. But what they had found was that, farms that were downwind from many of the forest fires were showing a higher correlation for failing things like aerobic microbial counts in their cultivars, in their lots that they submitted into the Emerald Cup. So that year was a really bad year for forest fires in California. And they started putting on an ArcGIS, which is basically a big map, and saying, hey, here's all the farms that started failing for these microbials. They were growing the same strains as other farms, but when we look at these farms specifically, they were failing for microbials. Well, why is that? Well, it looks like these farms happen to be downwind of forest fires. Well, forest fires are going to be burning massive amounts of cellulose and plant material and releasing cellulose plant material and spores into the air in the form of ash. Depending on how hot that fire is, it may not sterilize all the bacterial or mold spores. So when that ash then precipitates and falls out of the air downwind, if it falls onto a cannabis plant, you may actually be introducing things like mold spores into the cannabis that could then cause your crop to fail for microbial testing at fall harvest. So what we ended up seeing was that when I heard that, I was like, oh yeah, these guys are failing for microbial content. That's unfortunate. What I've also found interesting was that some of these farms that were growing clones were exhibiting different cannabinoid contents than the farms that were not failing for these aerobic bacteria. So what was hypothesized at the time was that there is likely some form of enzymatic degradation where these bacteria or fungi or molds that are growing on the plant may actually be degrading the cannabinoids. One that was identified was a cannabinoid called CBL. I've also seen CBGM and CBC produced on failed microbial crops at a higher percentage than non-failed microbial crops. So that's something that's unfortunately going to require a well-funded farm to proactively contaminate or inoculate their crops. But while that's not, while I haven't heard that done yet for bacteria, I have heard that done for pesticides, where farms are basically trying to get pesticides approved on cannabis, but they have to spray the cannabis and then test it after it's been harvested, determine at which level it's safe, etc. Same thing's gonna have to be done with cannabis. Hasn't been done yet, but it has been done in the wine industry. So some of the listeners to this show may drink wine. There is actually a type of wine called ice wine or sweet wine. And what will actually happen.
Sortilege is my favorite of those.
Yeah,
I guess that's
totally. So what they will actually do is, in order to increase the sugar content, is actually introduce a bacteria that is not good for cannabis, but when they spray that bacteria onto the grapes, it'll actually help metabolize some of the starches in those grapes into sugars. When they, inoculate botrytis, I believe it's botrytis, inoculate botrytis onto your grapevines, the botrytis then helps metabolize the starches into sugar. When you harvest that botrytis-laden grapes, you're going to have a higher sugar content in your grape juice. When you then ferment that higher sugar content grape juice into wine, it's going to end up producing a wine that has not only higher alcohol content, but also higher sugar content, producing things like the Gewürztraminers and Rieslings that also have, a higher sugar content, but also slightly sweeter taste. So they're oftentimes consumed for desserts because of the higher sugar content.
Very
And then,
very smooth.
yeah, great, smooth. But it's not, that's really only done in places that oftentimes have wet falls. Yeah, there's another thing that may affect the terpene content in the wine industry, which is the mineral content of the soil. So many people who are wine consumers will actually start to learn that there's different mineralities of the. Yeah, totally. I'm gonna have to find this. So when I grow, say, a Merlot on a sandstone soil or a limestone soil, it's going to produce a more tawny, which is kind of a richer, darker, and chalkier taste, as opposed to if I grow that same Merlot grape on a granitic soil. And it has to do with, essentially, as the plants and as the soil bacteria are breaking down the minerals, forming clay complexes with either calcium or magnesium, those subtle mineral contents will actually change the cation exchange capacity of those soils, allowing those soils to hold different nutrients for a different amount of time, and allowing the fungi and bacteria to then exchange those minerals in exchange for sugar with those plants. So just like there's different wine producing regions, growing things like Champagne in the Champagne Valley, or Burgundy in the Burgundy Valley, or the red wines in the dry climates of Spain and Northern California, some of the great white wines that are grown in places like Washington and BC. Each of these regions has a different mineral content and environment that allows for the best production of a specific grape. And I think the same thing is going to be true with cannabis. There's going to be different regions that are able to produce cannabis cultivars based on things like the mineral content, the terpene content, and the nutrient content of the minerals in the soil, as well as the compost from the environment. As an example, here in BC, we have lots of pine trees. So as pine trees are harvested and sent through the lumber mill, it produces a wood chip, and that wood chip's oftentimes used as a pine mulch. If I spread pine mulch that's high in pinene, as the fungi break down that pine mulch into starches and sugars and all these other compounds, there's going to be a greater than nominal average percentage of pinene in that mulch that can then be transported via the fungal microbiome into the cannabis plant in exchange for sugar, because fungi don't photosynthesize, but they will gladly trade minerals and terpenoid precursors in exchange for sugar from the plants. Whereas, places like Napa Valley, California has tons of grape compost.
I'm sorry. There was just a ridiculous bot in
Oh,
chat.
I see it now.
It was advertising something that we won't mention on video, but it just had a completely ridiculous name that was too funny not to mention. I didn't mean to derail the show.
So by inoculating your mulch with a higher percentage of, let's call it, compost, you can, depending on what biomass goes into that compost and what fungi are decomposing that, you might be able to produce a beautiful girl, or you might be able to produce a funky girl. So depending on the mineral content and soil content and organic compost content of the soil, you're actually going to have different regions throughout the world. Chad, you hit it on the head, producing different appellations, and those different appellations are going to be able to produce different terpene profiles that are unique to those different regions. So, here in BC, I'm actually working at a farm. 3 sides of the farm have blueberry fields, and this farm has actually a couple of strains that have blueberry in it, including a Blue Dream. I got so tired of Blue Dream by 2010 that I thought I would never grow it again. Honestly, there's a strain here at this facility that's a Blue Dream, and it tastes more like a blueberry than it does a Blue Dream. And it's a wonderful representation of the flavor. I know I have a couple buddies who run other farms that have a slightly different mineral content in their soil. They're not in the valley; they're up in the mountains a bit, and they produce a blueberry flavored strain that has a much more fuely back end, whereas the blueberry grown in the Fraser Valley oftentimes has more of a sweeter back end. So you're going to end up having kind of different regions producing different strains, whether it be based on the environment, right? I love haze plants. I grew a lamb's bread haze a year and a half ago that harvested in the 3rd week of January. You can't really grow 3rd week of January plants here in British Columbia. So I had to actually grow it on my patio and then move it from my patio into the living room, where I had a 12-foot tall plant growing in my patio until middle of January when I harvested it. So something like a lamb's bread haze that I crossed with made a garlic bread haze, lamb's bread haze crossed with GMO on haze. That strain was a wonderful strain to smoke, very stimulating, probably more evolutionary adapted to grow in a more equatorial climate. Whereas some of those more indica strains, more hybrid strains, or strains evolved in the Hindu Kush Mountains or in the high altitude mountains of California, are probably going to be growing better in places like the Rockies or the Kootenays. Places here where we're at in Vancouver, we're a very coastal climate, so we don't have to deal with as cold of the winters. We can run longer season strains, but we have to have strains that are very robust against high humidity, because here in Vancouver, it starts raining in September and doesn't stop until April or May. So if you have a strain that has real broad leaves and thin waxy cuticles susceptible to mold or mildews, you're not going to have a good time growing that outside, unless if it's a early finishing autoflower hybrid. So what you'll end up seeing is there's going to be some of those strains that evolve to grow in different regions, and different one of those regions would end up being able to produce a different terpene profile that's really unique. That's it, mods. If you use a frankincense mulch to cultivate and grow some wild terps, let me know. I want to try it. I love frankincense terps. I've actually talked to a couple of farms that are on the kind of pure path of regenerative farming, and that's actually what they're starting to incorporate. I actually had a conversation with one of my business partners last week, and she was asking, what differentiates a craft producer from a LP? Well, I could use the very narrow government definition. Here in Canada, they said if you're under 200 square meters, which is 2152 square feet, you're a craft producer. Well, that really doesn't take you into the appellation very much, right? And that opens up the door for craft producers growing hydroponic mids, and just because they got a small grow, they can call it craft. Well, I'm going to take that a step further.
It's
Craft
also
farmers,
but it's hard to be sustainable as far as labor and all the rest of it by the time you actually do it at that scale. I've worked with a couple people.
Totally.
They can
So,
be kind of pinch the pennies.
so what I consider craft is not so much the size of your grow, but how you're tailoring that grow to the cannabis that you're cultivating, right? So if you have a relatively large grow, but you have it split up where, hey, this greenhouse is growing our sativa dominant strains. I've custom tailored the nutrients that I've amended into the soil specifically for that sativa. I've custom tailored the lighting spectrum because I have a tunable LED. It's going to produce a bluer spectrum of light that's closer to the equatorial sunlight. And I'm going to have that whole greenhouse be my sativa greenhouse. Next to it is going to be my indica greenhouse or my CBD greenhouse. There's actually light spectrums that I found in the 720 to 750 nanometer range that will upregulate the CBD A synthase and downregulate the THC A synthase. What's that mean? CBD strains grown closer to the equator should produce more THC, and CBD strains grown farther away from the equator should produce more CBD. That's why we're seeing hemp farmers in the Southeast growing hemp strains that grow great in Oregon, but end up having too much THC when they grow them close to the equator. The blue spectrum actually upregulates the THC production. The red spectrum upregulates the CBDA synthase enzymes. So there's going to be different regions producing different trichomes, different essential oils, as well as there's going to be different, for example, mulches or composts that are going to provide those bacteria, the different precursors to allow for the production of a variety of different terpene profiles.
I know a lot of people have been growing chamomile. Was it chamomile and a couple of other crops specifically with it? I'm a big fan of growing thyme and with thymol to help discourage pests, but I know there's
as a
quite few
mulch
of it. Yeah.
cover crop. Yeah, catnip, thyme, marigolds also naturally produce pyrethrins. I like to do marigolds at the end of my hedgerows because it's going to essentially act as a buffer. So at the end of each of the hedgerows, I like to do a bean plant and marigold plant and sunflower. The marigold is going to naturally produce pyrethrins. The bean plant is going to act as a trap plant. So any bugs that are coming in from the neighbors, I'll see them on that bean plant before I see them on my cannabis plant. And then I can yank out the bee plant, move it on. And then the sunflower primarily because it attracts the beneficial insect-eating birds. So there's actually some benefit to having birds in your property because they'll eat the mosquitoes, but they'll also eat some of the things like the aphids and aphids, springtails, whiteflies, and
Grasshoppers.
there you go, grasshoppers. Yeah, pretty much anything that floats flies, right? And then if you got things like slugs or snails getting ducks in your grow is always beneficial. So
Ducks are amazing if you're doing any kind of larger scale. For
yeah,
general,
totally.
they kick ass.
Totally. Yeah, I've actually seen more ducks, but not enough, right? I think that's going to be something that actually contributes to your terroir, right? Because you now have ducks that are acting as a anti-pest, but they're also depositing a phosphate-rich manure into your environment. Some of the more regulated authority having jurisdictions don't like having that biodynamic system. In the early days of Washington, they had a zero tolerance on all aerobic bacteria, which made compost teas almost impossible to apply. Since then, they've actually reduced that level, allowed some level of acceptable level of aerobic bacteria. But for the better part of it, it's, many of those organic methodologies that were allowed and very beneficial to the cannabis plant ecosystem, because they don't have the data, because they haven't gone through the necessary regulatory approvals, they become a lot more harder to get approved within the federally regulated system. Health Canada doesn't want me to make a compost tea and spray it on the plants because they're afraid that I might make E. coli compost tea. Now, I'm pretty good at making compost tea, and I know how to do the scope. That was a great video, by the way, the other day, setting up the scope. Check that on Ponics. If you guys don't have a scope, get a scope. If you need a scope for identifying your bugs, beneficial or otherwise, you need a scope for identifying your bacteria. Yeah. So I forgot to bring it with me, but I actually have a handheld scope. Looks like one of those old flip movie cameras, but it's got a screen on it, so I can actually walk around in my grow just like those Dynolite. It's basically a Dynolite with its own screen on it, and I can actually go up to it and look on the screen at my plants while they're on the plant. And then as I walk those hedgerows, I can actually say, hey, I see some stippling on the leaf over there. Let me go scope it, right? And then I don't actually have to worry about picking that leaf off, going back to my office or wherever the scope microscope is, and then putting it under there.
For sure. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's super cool. Yeah, no, we'll be doing a whole bunch of videos on KNF stuff. That was kind of everything that could go wrong did go wrong shooting that video just about, but it was pretty funny.
So I see a comment from Southern Grower. Ducks rock, but they like to eat too many worms, them pigs. You need to apply more mulch, bro. If your ducks are able to get to your worms, apply more mulch, because the worms will climb up into your mulch layer, but they won't climb all the way through it unless if they're looking for food. So yeah, I love ducks, and yeah, they do eat my worms. But when I see them going for worms instead of aphids, or eat ducks will even eat the little shitty leaves and plant matter if little grass is growing between the plants. So I love ducks. They're awesome, but they will eat your worms. So you want to keep applying mulch. For all the regenerative farmers out there, I've got a great tip for mulch. Here in the regulated industry, you actually have to destroy all of your plant byproduct. So we have a giant wood chipper here that every time we harvest plant material, pick leaves off, we have to harvest plants, buck stems. We have biomass, make bubble hash, make dry sift. We have spent biomass. That spent biomass gets sent through a wood chipper. Well, you could just take that wood chipped biomass and send it to your local compost company, who's then going to mix it with a bunch of other stuff, turn it into soil and sell it back to you. Or you can make it into mulch yourself. So what I do on my personal medical home grow is actually grind up the hemp stems or the cannabis stems, send them through a wood chipper, grind up the plants and leaves, send it through a wood chipper, and then I'll do a mix of 30% leaves, 30% stems, and generally 20 to 30% other amendments. So compost, oyster shell, lobster shell, and hemp herds, and then biocache, a bunch of other amendments depending on the soil nutrient test. So rather than amending my soil each round, what I do when I do my big fields, I just apply mulch, and that mulch has all the amendments for next year. So I don't have to mix amendments during my summer when I'm growing fields. I just take towards the end of the season, I take a soil sample, depending on what nutrients are low in that field. As I'm chipping the wood, chipping the stalks, and wood chipping all the leaves that got pulled off, I've got 2/3 of all the ingredients going into my mulch. And I just got to know how much of the other amendments I got to add, and essentially rebuild the soil surface. And then obviously the following year, you're going to get cover crop growing through it. As that cover crop dies off, the worms will slowly eat through the mulch, eat through the cover crop. And you get a cycle where you're slowly building layers and layers and layers to it. So I just got a message. I actually got to go do work stuff. So
Okay.
let's wrap it up maybe in the next 2-3 minutes. Does anybody have any other questions before I actually have to?
The only question I had is that you had a chance to come out and take one of the in-person classes that we taught out at Josh's farm. I don't know if you want to touch on that real quick for a second. If not, that's fine too.
Yeah. So I love Josh's farm. Beautiful little farm. I mean, even though I've been cultivating cannabis for going on 15 years, I can't say that I've ever commercially run an aquaponic farm. Done hydroponic, done aeroponic, done organic, done the whole gamut, but I've never grown it with fish. So even I had the opportunity to go out to visit one of your early classes at Dutch Bloom's farm in Washington. And we got to go, let's see, we built a couple of ponds. We did some cover cropping. We did some composting. We made some IMO 1 through 4. Tons of fun stuff, tons of great times. Everybody that's learning, because even myself, I've been growing for going on 15 years, running publicly traded companies for 5 years, running licensed labs for a decade. I learned tons of stuff during that class. And it was stuff that like I thought I had already partially knew, but things like making WCA, water soluble calcium and stuff like that, just little tips and trips. When as growers start to transition, growing more and more and more, the cost to produce becomes much more critical. If I'm trying to produce a kilo of CBD isolate for under $300, as opposed to a kilo of flower that I can sell for 3,000, if I'm trying to produce that kilo of ultra purified extract at that low cost, I have to be as sustainable as possible. So being able to derive nutrients from our local ecosystem, incorporate that Appalachia into our grow, and learning how to cycle those nutrients efficiently can dramatically reduce the costs of operations. Because if you can cut down the amount of money you're spending on soil, amount of money you're spending on light, using things like recycling water through the aquaponics or SIPs or good water management, I've seen growers, publicly traded growers, reduce their cost by 70%. So you're talking about growers that used to produce flower at say $2 a gram, now being able to produce it for under 40 or 50 cents a gram. And that can make or break a publicly traded company. If a publicly traded company is not producing cannabis for under $2 a gram this year and under $1 a gram in 3 years from now, they're going to go out of business. And I've seen publicly traded companies that are producing cannabis right now for $1.80 a gram. I also know guys that are producing cannabis sustainably, regeneratively, better quality cannabis for under $0.10 a gram. So there's going to be a whole gamut of costs to produce, but I think what's going to give many of the small producers that are watching this film the tools to succeed are going to be the knowledge of how to cycle nutrients sustainably so that you don't have to buy soil. You don't have to buy nutrients. You don't have to buy inoculants every season or every cycle. I can't count the number of publicly traded grows that buy soil, do a mild amendment, use the soil once, and throw it into a giant pile out back. It disgusts me when I see these giant piles of soil, and to me, that's their second most valuable asset. Number one most valuable is your employees. You have to pay to retrain your employees, and the last thing you want to have is employees bad mouthing your company. Beyond your labor, the second most in cultivation is your terroir. So you cannot be a craft producer if you're using your soil once and throwing it away, or growing in hydro. If you're not incorporating the natural minerals, you're going to end up producing a lower grade product. So
wonderful. So how can people find you and find out more information if you want to learn more from the different wonderful knowledge that you have? You've been on the show once or twice before. People can find those episodes. I apologize for not looking up the numbers before that, but you can certainly search Mike West on Ponics.
I'm a ghost within the industry. I try and stay a ghost just to avoid the haters because stress induces my epilepsy. So if guys have any questions, you can find me on Facebook, MC West. You can find me on Instagram, west.mc. You can email me, west.michael.c@gmail.com. And if you're a licensed producer or trying to get a license, feel free. And then if you're in Canada, please buy Cannabis. Some of the brands that I've been affiliated with, Embark, they're producing the Hank brand, Hazel brand, Meridian brands. Bev Canna acquired them this spring, so they're producing Keef Cola here in Canada. I'm also working with Simply Bear in 1964 and Lab Theory through the Rubicon publicly traded company. And coming up this fall, I'm going to be bringing a co-op of micro producers to market through a company called Antidote. So that'll be kind of a co-op manufacturer packager for a bunch of the micros up in the Kootenays. If you're down in the States, whole gamut of different companies you can support. But none of them pay me to tell you to support them. So support them if you like supporting corporate weed. If you don't support, what I always tell people is find the best organic, sustainable, local producer you can, and empower them to do the best. Talk good things about them. I'm growing with Rubicon here is one of the largest organic certified farms in North America, but I want to help everyone get organic certified and licensed, because that's where we're going to really see the quality start to get produced. So,
Well, thank you so much for your time. It's always a pleasure having you on. You're certainly one of our favorite guests to have on the show, and certainly, in my opinion, the guru of gurus when it comes to extraction. So thank you so much for coming on and giving us your time.
of course, Steve. All right, guys. Well, I'll talk to you soon, and when I make it down, if I don't see you guys at Josh's place in a couple months, we'll maybe see you at the Unicorn Cup this August.
Awesome, man. Thanks a lot. Cheers.
Cheers. Talk to you soon.
Peace. It's always a pleasure to have Mike on the show. Really appreciate him taking the time to come on. And if you guys again should check out his Instagram among other things. You can get his products through Embark and the other companies that he mentioned there at the end. If you guys are looking to learn more about aquaponic cannabis and want to take the class, a longer version than the one that he took, you can check us out over at apmjclass.com. Marty and I have a huge class we put together over there. There's a ton of different topics that we've covered, over 600 or 700 different talks on there. We're actually adding a whole bunch. I actually have a complete overhaul for all of pest management that we'll be adding, and then also offering as a separate class by itself for those that are interested in vegetable and regular gardens and aquaponics. We're going to be offering just that. I'm going to kind of roll the advanced aquaponics class into a couple of different sections. You'll be able to buy that as kind of all the different sections or just individual topics. If you just want to, cue in on something to try and make it a little more affordable. I know everybody doesn't have quite as much money as they did before COVID, so we're trying to make things a little more affordable for people and still allow the funding of continued research down some of these topics. So definitely looking forward to that. I just finished up the slide deck for that. Just kind of doing an editorial quick last sweep on it before we go ahead and record it, and then we'll get that out to you guys here in the next couple of weeks. I'm also going to be working on a couple of other classes. We have the tropical fish class that we're putting together, the advanced class, a couple of other aquaponic classes that I used to teach back in the day, and then kind of updating them now for some of the modern knowledge that we have now on aquaponics. All right, guys. Next week we have the gentleman from BioAg will be with us, so certainly looking forward to that. And yeah, we have some other cool guests in the queue. I won't spoil them, but we were certainly keeping up on the really awesome guests that we've had lately, and yeah, appreciate y'all. The next episode we have actually will be Tuesday. Season George will be back with us from Humboldt. She'll be talking about kind of an update on what's going on at her farm. They have a big tour and some other things going on out there. She's going to be talking to us about. So that'll be back on Tuesday at 7:30 p.m. Will be our next episode. All right, guys, take it easy. You can find us on SoundCloud, YouTube, iTunes, Spotify, all the things. You can watch us live on YouTube. I will have a bunch of additional YouTube content. We'll be launching the Patreon soon. I actually have the microscope video. I will be relaunching the microscope video in a little bit better edited format with less bloopers as we're trying to record the damn thing, because everything that went wrong could go wrong when we tried to record it the first time, but I'll leave it up because it's a pretty funny watch for everybody. But we're going to re-record that and get that a little bit more slick and get that up there. And then we're going to have on the Patreon a bunch of breakdowns and a whole bunch of stuff. So all the stuff from the Patreon will be available for free on the YouTube channel, but we're going to have kind of a 60 or 90 day advanced things. So if you want to find the latest stuff, you can find it on the YouTube, on the Patreon, and then everything will still end up on the YouTube either way. So, you know, don't feel like you're going to miss out if you can't afford it, but just trying to help monetize the content production, because I have a bunch of stuff I want to start doing. But I want to kind of have it help fund itself a little bit to get into some of this. But we're going to have, the first thing that we're going to do is a whole comparison of lactobacillus. So I have water kefir. I have kefir coming from Josh from Dutch Blooms. He's sending me some of the stuff that he has with his lactobacillus. I have some regular store-bought kefir grains. I have some powdered lactobacillus. I have some probiotics that you can get from the pharmaceutical store. So we're going to do all of those separately. We're going to inoculate them into jars and containers. We're going to see which one grows fastest. We're going to look at them together under the microscope and do kind of an in-depth analysis on the different lactobacillus starter cultures, and then look into the plant efficacy of that afterwards. So it's going to be a really cool way to break that down, look into the speeds of colonization of lactobacillus and some of the other cool things that I really haven't seen done in kind of the KNF space. And I don't want to like do the same stuff that some of my friends are doing in the KNF space. So I'm trying to do a little bit different, unique content. And I think that's definitely going to fit that space as well, and start off with that. And then I want to get into IMOs and doing a lot of microscope work with that, and then liquid IMOs and then IPMO. So we're going to, you know, kind of in that order. So looking forward to that as well. I have all the lactobacillus here now. So this weekend I'm going to start doing the filming for the lactobacillus. So looking forward to that. All right, guys. Thanks for watching again. Spotify, YouTube, iTunes. Whatever it is that you like enjoying listening to the show on. We'll catch you guys again on Tuesday with